God morgen, buenos dias, and warmly welcome to the Visionary Romantics Seminar. I am Hanne Beate Ueland, the director here at Stavanger Art Museum, a part of Museum Stavanger. I am delighted to be here today among esteemed art historians and fellow friends of the arts. Stavanger Art Museum boasts a collection of approximately 3,500 artworks. Among our most remarkable pieces are those created by the 19th and early 20th century artists such as Kitty Kielland, Olav Lange, Frida Hansen, and Lars Hertervig, all connected to our region. These are all artists whom the Stavanger Art Museum actively promotes through exhibitions, research, and publications. Lars Hertervig is regarded as one of the preeminent Norwegian painters of the 19th century. Yet, with few exceptions, his work has seldom been exhibited beyond the borders of Norway. Our museum has long aspired to bring great attention to this artist's body of work. Our aim for Lars Hertervig's art is to secure its rightful place in the history of international romantic art. A couple of years ago, we initiated a collaboration with the Nordic Institute of Art, facilitated by Knut Ljøgodt, to bring more attention to Hertervig also internationally. He introduced us to Centro de Estudios Europa Hispánica and the Museo Lázaro Galdiano. The idea was to organize an exhibition featuring Lars Hertervig alongside Peder Balke and the Spanish artist Eugenio Lucas Velázquez. In addition to organizing and curating the exhibition, we endeavored to capture the attention of art historians by inviting them to participate in a study day. When the exhibition premiered in Madrid in March, we held a seminar with contributions from our esteemed collaborators, including both José Luis Colomer from the Centro de Estudios Europa Hispánica, Begoña Torres and Carlos Sánchez Díez from the Museo Lázaro Galdiano, Knut Ljøgodt from the Nordic Institute of Art, Inger Gudmundsson and myself representing Stavanger Art Museum. In addition, the study day also included art historian and curator Carl Johan Olsson from the National Museum in Stockholm, as well as Professor Claudia Hopkins from the Sobaran Center for Spanish and Latin American Art at Durham University. As the exhibition now has relocated to Stavanger, we wanted to further develop the project by inviting other distinguished art historians to engage in discussions about the concept of the visionary romantics and partly focus on Lars Hertervig's place in this. Today, we eagerly anticipate hearing from Professor Kilian Heck, Dr. Nicholas Tromans, and Mag Art Holger van Koefoed, as well as Knut Ljøgodt and Carlos Sánchez Díez. For this dialogue to unfold, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to our generous collaborators, Museo Lázaro Galdiano, Centro de Estudios Europa Hispánica, and the Nordic Institute of Art. I also want to express our appreciation to our valuable sponsors, Lærdal Medical AS, the Savings Bank Foundation DNB, Bergesen Foundation, the Gundersen Collection, the Norwegian Embassy in Madrid, and the Spanish Embassy in Oslo. On a practical note, please be aware that this seminar is being recorded and the video will be available on our online platforms. We are not conducting a live stream, so there is no need to be concerned. However, for those in the audience who wish to ask questions at the end, please remember to use a microphone. In case of an emergency, there are two exit routes. One located at the back to your left, and the other one here in the front. Restrooms are conveniently situated just outside to the left. And now I am pleased to introduce José Luis Colomer, who will moderate the first session. José Luis Colomer holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Bologna and holds a degree in art history from the Sorbonne. Currently, he serves as a director for the Centro de Estudios Europa Hispánica and the Center for Spain in America. The primary mission of both entities is to promote the study of the international reception of Spanish art and culture. He has co-edited several volumes, including Collecting Spanish Art, Spain's Golden Age and America's Gilded Age with Inge Reist, and Sorolla in America, Friends and Patrons, with Bianca Pons Sorolla and Mark A. Rogan.
morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Kilian Heck, who is Professor of Art History at the Caspar David Friedrich Institute at the University of Greifswald and an Associate Fellow of the Nordic Institute of Art. His research focuses on the relationship of art and science in the 19th century, German sepulchral sculpture, and German court art of the 15th to 17th centuries, the political iconography of the early modern period, and castle architecture of the 18th century. As part of his research on restitution and provenance, Kilian Heck deals with the history of the origin of paintings. He has published extensively on German Romanticism and is a leading scholar on works on the landscape painter Karl Blechen. He arrived here yesterday directly from Ukraine, where he is helping art historians protect their museum collections and artistic heritage with support from the Association of German Art Historians, of which he is the president. Professor Heck will deliver the keynote lecture to our seminar, which is entitled What We Could Learn About the North and Romanticism by Looking at the Object Biographies of Caspar David Friedrich's Works. And I will now hand it over to him.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation to Stavanger. Actually, I would like to thank Hanne-Beate and Knut for that kind invitation because it's my first time to Stavanger. I saw the collection yesterday and also the special exhibition. I was deeply impressed about all that, and I'm really happy to be here and to show you something on Caspar David Friedrich. Yeah, that's my university, and it's actually a photo from my office. And on the other side of the street, you can see the university building from mid-18th century. We were Swedish for 160 years in Greifswald, and in that time, Caspar David Friedrich began as a student in the drawing class of our university, and it was exactly that building where he was raised as a drawer and painter. And later in 1794, he was born in 1774, so next year we have the 250th birthday. So in the age of 20, he left Greifswald and went to the Copenhagen Academy to become a painter. So, but I will not so much talk about the biography of Caspar David Friedrich. I will more talk on the rediscovery and also on the provenance of the paintings and also what we call object biographies of his paintings. So my first part has to do with the rediscovery of Caspar David Friedrich because it's quite interesting. When he died in 1840 in Dresden, where also Johann Christian Clausen Dahl, the famous Norwegian painter, lived in the same house like Caspar David Friedrich. They were close friends. He was, after his death, totally unknown for for many years. So there was a big gap of 66 years before he became rediscovered in 1906, and I would like to talk about this thing. The reason why he was forgotten in a way, I mean, we have this normal symptoms that we say geniuses are forgotten and then they are rediscovered. That's maybe a miracle in a way, but in Caspar David Friedrich's case, it's really true. But the reason for that is the rising of the Düsseldorf school, which was quite important in mid-19th century, not only in Germany. For example, members of the Hudson River School, the famous American school with Thomas Kuhl or Albert Bierstedt, they all had to do, or they studied in Düsseldorf. Also Hertervig studied in Düsseldorf. It was the school of painting in Germany, and there came students all over Europe and also from America to Düsseldorf. And the reason why they were so successful is that they in a way had the imitation of nature in a three-dimensional way. You have, for example, this wonderful painting here in the collection. I really admired by Hans Friedrich Güde, who was also teacher in Düsseldorf, Norwegian mountains in 1856. And what you see is a kind of three-dimensional look over the mountains, and it's completely constructed in the way that you have a three-dimensional room and a vantage point somewhere here, and all the lines go up to that vantage point, and though you have the imitation of a what we call three-dimensional room. And this was totally successful. But when you see now Friedrich paintings, here you have three of the maybe most important of him, the chalk riffs on Rügen and the Sea of Ice and the Wanderer. You may have seen some of these paintings. You see they are completely different to that kind or to that manner of constructing three-dimensional rooms. The thing is, you do not have a specific vantage point. Okay, it must be somewhere here, but on the other hand, the vantage point is hidden. Yeah, it's hidden by the sea, or it's hidden by the ice rock, or it's hidden by the Wanderer. So this changed completely the painting, because it's not a deep room into the deepness of the atmosphere. It is something else, which is in 1906 something which was quite modern. And you excuse me this comparison, I know I will show you now. It is the Demoiselles d'Avignon, which are from 1907, exactly the year after the finding or Wiederentdeckung of Caspar David Friedrich, that you have in the same way the dissolution of the three-dimensional room. Yeah, you also have figures in the front, and they hide the vantage point. Yeah, and this is a completely different way of painting, because you have more a kind of rhythm of persons which come from the left side to the right side. And it's not very important to have a deep room anymore. So the thing is, why I compare these both artists is only that in Friedrich's case, you had also these big figures, the so-called Rückenfiguren, back figures, which look into the room. And in 1906, this was, for the contemporaries of that time, something which they feel as a very new kind of modeling the room of painting. That's the only point, yeah. And so that is one of the reasons why Caspar David Friedrich was in a way reinvented in about 1906, yeah. And just to show you what is so new, I will talk a little bit more about this exhibition. Okay, this is the exhibition. It is the Century Exhibition or Centennial Exhibition in the National Gallery in Berlin in 1906. This is the poster of that exhibition, and here you see the National Gallery, and that's the setting by Peter Behrens, who is a really important architect. He was not the founder of the Bauhaus, but he was one of the predecessors of the Bauhaus. He was in that time really a good modern architect. You see these paintings setting is completely different from a 19th century setting like they designed galleries. Also this kind, it's quite modern. You have this Peter Dorothy, you have the white cube idea in a way already in 1906. And this was the exhibition in 1906, and each German contemporary artists went to that exhibition, yeah, and also the art historians and also the collectors who bought then German Romantic came to that exhibition. It was absolutely well known. It's comparable to the Armory show in the US in 1913 in its meaning for Germany. And here is the preface catalogue. It was curated by Hugo von Schudi, Alfred Lichtwag, who was the director of the Hamburger Kunsthalle, and the third one was Julius Meyer-Gräfe, who was an art historian who spent a lot of time in France before. And the idea is, and that's important, that it showed 200 years of German art. So it was a kind of reinvention of German art. And the interesting thing is you had many pieces for the first time of Caspar David Friedrich in that exhibition. For example, I will show you the painting later, the Monk at the Sea. It's one of the most important paintings, and in this painting, you have the description by Meyer Gräfe, and you have the idea that he is talking about an impressionist painting, like painted by Claude Monet. He describes the sky, the scouts, the fog, and the idea of that is, and you have to think about the context, it's before World War I, that the French, you may start laughing now, that the French Impressionism is an invention by the German Romantic art. That's it. And the thing is, on the same time, you had this competition in the architecture that we had a big struggle about where the Gothic style was invented. And the Germans said, okay, it was invented in Strasbourg, so it is a German invention. And the French said, no, it's invented in the Ile-de-France, in Notre Dame, and wherever. And so you see, it's a context of the time you have to be focused on. And that was the reason why all the collectors began to start romantic art, to collect romantic art. Especially Jewish collectors in Germany started to buy Karl Blechen and Caspar David Friedrich and others. So that's important for my thesis now on object biography. So, and these are photos from paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, which are photos from the catalog in 1906. Yeah, so they are not good, because it's the time of when they were produced, that they are not so good. But here you see a woman at the window from 1822, or the called Lebensstufen, life steps in Leipzig now. From I think it's later, it's 1830 around, yeah. And here you have also a Rückenfigur, back figure. This is maybe Caspar David Friedrich as an old man. We don't know exactly. These might be members of this family. And here you see, that's interesting, you can't see that very good. It's a blue-yellow flag. It's the Swedish cross, because Greifswald and Friedrich were in fact Swedish. They were not German by citizenship, they were Swedish. So, part two, the significance of an object biography in the research on Friedrich's oeuvre. That's something which is important for my idea. Example one. So I will show you just 3 examples why an object biography is also important for the interpretation of a painter. The archival material on Woman in Front of the Setting Sun from 1818. This painting is now in the Museum Volkwang in Essen, and there's a huge debate in German art history if this is a rising, a sunset, or a sunrise. Yeah? And I mean, I do not kidding. There are books written on that specific topic. Well. And most of them say, okay, it's a sunset because it's the Christian woman who looks on the end of her life. Yeah, so it's a sunset. The problem is, we found in our archive, in the Caspar David Friedrich Institute, our archive was founded in a very problematic time, in the Nazi time, in the 1930s. But they collect a lot of material which we never researched on. And we found a list of paintings and drawings by which is Sophie Siemsen, is the wife of a nephew of Caspar David Friedrich. And Caspar David Friedrich was very much dedicated to his own family. So he gave a lot of paintings to family members. That's really important. And under number 3, I can show you, under number 3, painting with a title Sunrise is listed. This can only be the Essen painting, Woman in Front of the Setting Sun. This painting was inherited by Anna Siemsen from her mother, who was a niece of CDF, CDF is Caspar David Friedrich, in 1930, and then sold in 1937 to Gerstenberg GmbH in Chemnitz, from which it then came to the Folkwang Museum. So, and here you have the number 3, and it says Sonnenaufgang. So it's sunrise. Yeah. So all that books are wrong. Yeah, in a way, because the family who owned that painting for decades, it was always known as Sonnenaufgang. Yeah? So that's an important hint sometimes that archival material is really important in a way, that you really can stop discussions, mad discussions maybe, about what is really depicted. So example 2, what is also for an object biography very important are old photographs. Here I show you 3 photographs from our archive. They are all from the 1930s, and I will show you one after the other. I wanted to start with that. Here you have a drawing by Caspar David Friedrich. He was a really elaborated drawer, and he went to the Rügen Island, which is not far from Greifswald, and he exactly said this is painted in 1809 and so on. And this is the photo from our archive, and this is the photo I took yesterday from the website. I saved it down from the National Museum in Oslo. The thing is, the first researcher who is also very important for the 1906 exhibition is the Norwegian Andreas Aubert. He was one of the great first researcher on Caspar David Friedrich, and he was responsible that a lot of drawings especially, and also some wonderful paintings of Caspar David Friedrich came to Oslo, to Norway. And the interesting thing is that we have here a photo from the 1930s, which was also from the Oslo sketchbook, and it's about 1935. So it's maybe you will ask, okay, they look so similar, what's the matter with you? But when you see that, and when you see that, you have the idea that this is much more with color, yeah? That you have the idea that this is maybe not so influenced by light damages, because it's earlier. This is later, yeah. So you have to be critical about photographs, because photographs show mostly not exactly the original. But my assumption could be that older photographs are sometimes better to judge over a piece of art. Yeah, that's the other thing which is important for an object biography. And the third, for example, we have at least 16 drawings which are not in the Catalogue raisonné of the drawings of Caspar David Friedrich in our archive. We have not the drawings, we have the photos of the drawing. Yeah? And the drawings itself are lost. They were lost in 1945 during the bomb attack in Dresden. And but nobody knew that there are still existing photographs of the old drawings. So it's also important to have them, because almost we do not know exactly, but maybe the half of the oeuvre of Caspar David Friedrich was lost in 19th century. So it's really important to have examples of photographs from lost material. So, and we have 16, for example, from this lost Dresden collection. Yeah, my example 3 is restoration, which is also for an object biography very important. Here you have the Mönch am Meer, the monk at the sea, I was talking about in comparison to a Claude Monet painting. So the contemporaries in 1906 said this, I mean, only one figure, yeah, and you have the big sky, the clouds, the fog, and so this reminds us to Impressionist painting, but it's much earlier. It's from 1808 and 1810. You have here these 3 paintings, and the idea was in the interpretation that the monk has a kind of asking a question about what is my future. I'm desperate, I'm totally alone in the world, and there's only the big nature around me, And the thing is, the Christian belief may be the future. Yeah, so it's the question and the answer. So that was the interpretation, but others. So the answer is that you have here a Christian funeral, yeah, and a cloister, and so the Christian belief is the answer. There's also a huge debate on what is really the significance of the Christian belief or the Christian religion for Caspar David Friedrich. There are also tons of books written on that specific aspect. And here you have only one hint that this may true, the interpretation that this is the question painting and this is the answering painting, and this is the restoration. And this was the results of the restoration between 2013 and 2016. For example, this is the restorator, my colleague Christina Mösel, who was for 4 years the restorator. And here you can see them before they were restored, and you see the bad condition of the paintings. And what they found was that there is not only the monk, that there were 5 ships. In the infrared rays you can see that. And several ships were under the surface. The second result of that restoration was both paintings were painted of a common cotton tissue. That's also interesting, yeah. So what is a common cotton tissue? Cotton is the base for most of the oil paintings, and she could investigate on the structure of the tissue. And that she could show that these tissues were one common tissue. So that's interesting, because then you can say, okay, when they come from the same cotton, they may paint it as pendants, as the question and the answer paintings. Yeah, it's only a hint, but it's a good hint. Yeah, and the third aspect I just wanted to say is the abbey in the oak. Here, this one was painted in smalte, and it was in fact in the beginning much more blue. And so if you have older photographs, you can't see the blue because you do not have color photographs in mid-19th century. But you have now, after the investigation of the restorator, a good hint that this was not a brown painting, it was much more a blue painting. Yeah? That's quite interesting. So why I tell you all this is these things of the archival material or the restoration results are so important for interpretation. Yeah. So when you do not look onto that, you have a problem. So, and I have to written together what I think what's important for an object biography, a detailed provenance of a painting or drawing as far as you can get to the material. That's the point. And if it is the ideal, you should know all owners of the painting, all sellers and buyers, all heirs. That's important for especially Caspar David Friedrich, because I said it already, a lot of paintings were inherited by the family members. For all exhibitions since the creation of the work, all mentions of a work in an art historical inquiries, all mentions in other literature such as newspaper articles, letters, novels and archival material. 7 is photos, etchings, aquatintas, prints, and 8 is restoration methods and restoration documentations, because you also have different manners or methods of restoration. In the 19th century, the restorations were totally different from the today restorations. You do not have X-ray, you do not have infrared and other stuff. So the result, when all these points are examined in more detail, conjunctures can be grasped when looking at the works. This also allows for a better understanding of different ways of looking at and interpreting a work. The dependence and relativity of each interpretation of a work through the different times can be better understood. And that's something we now try in Greifswald to start research project together with Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin and the university in Jena to rewrite object biography in the case of Caspar David Friedrich. You have several hundred drawings and 300 paintings, and the idea is that then you have a much better access why, for example, art historians start to a specific time to research on a painter, because they were influenced maybe by a collector or they were influenced by an exhibition. That sounds not so maybe completely new, but at the whole, it's quite interesting when you go really in detail to the material. So, and now, as my third part, I would like to show you, and last part, I would like to show you 3 examples for an object biography. Here you have the chalk cliffs on Rügen, you have already seen it, this Sea of Ice and the Wanderer. And I start with the left one, with the chalk cliffs on Rügen. This is how they look like today. They are in the collection of Oskar Reinhardt in Winterthur in Switzerland. And here you can see them in the context of the gallery. And these photos I took 2 or 3 years ago in the gallery. Now they are also in these many exhibitions we have on Friedrich in the Jubilee year in 2024. We have drawings like that one, Shark Riffs, a watercolor which is in Leipzig, but it is, and that's also very typical, without people. Yeah, the people are only in the painting. And here you have them in a detailed photograph, and there's also a huge debate which people are depicted. Some of them say it's Friedrich's wife because he married in 1818, Caroline Bommer. It could be her, and this could be a friend or itself Friedrich. It's a kind of joke, of course, yeah, with the hat, and the third man you can see here. What is the history of the painting? We never knew something about the painting before the 1920s, but now, especially also with the investigations of the art historian Florian Illies, we know much more about that. But these are still assumptions. These are not facts I would like to show you now. Caroline Bardura was a German romantic painter and drawer. Here you see a self-portrait by her with guitar from 1822, and she was friend to Caspar David Friedrich. We know that because she's here depicted as a reading woman in that painting by Friedrich from 1811, and it was painted, this is now in Potsdam, but it was painted in Ballenstedt Castle in Saxonia, Sachsen-Anhalt, and we know that Friedrich was there and he was friend to her, they were correspondent and so on. And we know also that Caroline was a collector of Friedrich's paintings. We do not know which one it were, but here you have another example. This is a portrait by Caroline. She was really a absolutely perfect, good painter. She was not an academic because it was not allowed for women to go to the academy in that time. So she was autodidact in German. What is that in English? Yeah, okay. And here's her portrait of Caspar David Friedrich in 1810 in the National Gallery. And she was also friend to this woman. And this woman was her name was Louise. She was the princess of Anhalt who lived in Ballenstedt Castle. And she married a Prussian prince, Prince Friedrich of Prussia, and they lived at the Rhine Valley in a castle, and they collected lots of art, especially medieval art. Here you see an altarpiece by Stefan Lochner, who was a Cologne painter, and you see the couple, the princely couple in front of their dog, and the stained glass windows, which have the assumption of a Middle Ages castle, and the castle looks like that. It's still there, and here we had also the contents of an art collection, which is now not anymore in the castle. It was sold in the 1973. So here you can see the son and the stepson of that couple, and in the background it's a painting by Wilhelm Bach. In the background you see that it's deep Prussian romantic, Rhine romantic. Yeah. So, and the son of Friedrich was this guy, Prince Georg of Prussia. He was a very interested Berlin person. He was totally individualistic, independent. He was openly gay in the second half of 19th century, and he was also a collector. And he died in 1902. And when he died, there was an auction on his paintings in 1903 in the auction house Lepke. This is it still doesn't exist anymore. This is a photo from 1912 of that Lepke auction house. And there the painting was auctioned. But the interesting thing is, it was said in the catalogue that this painting is by Karl Blechen, not by Caspar David Friedrich. And there were two art historians, Guido Josef Kern and very problematic art historian Kurt Eberlein, who said, no, this is not by Karl Blechen, it's obviously by Caspar David Friedrich. So, and one of the collectors, in Berlin I mentioned Jewish collectors, was Julius Freund. And Julius Freund, this is a painting by Max Slevogt from 1925. He was one of these guys who were in the exhibition in 1906 and were fascinated to collect German Romantic art, yeah, because they wanted to show we are good German citizens, yeah. And so he had a major important collection of Romantic art, and he was forced to immigrate in 1933, and he died during a bomb attack in 1941 in London in exile. And his family gave all the material in 1942 to a Swiss auction house, Fischer in Luzern, and most of them were auctioned in that time. But the Wanderer, the Chalk-Cliffs by Friedrich, who he bought in 1915 in a second auction at Lemke, was already sold earlier to a Swiss collector, Oskar Reinhardt. And since then, in 1930, the painting is still there. So, and the interesting thing is that his daughter is Giselle Freund, who is one of the most important photographer in the 20th century. You may know her portraits of James Joyce and others important persons. And she had an interview in 1993, and in this interview she mentioned, I was born under the painting Chalk-Cliffs of Rügen by Caspar David Friedrich. And when she was in exile, she always said, when she was asked where you come from, she said, I come from Rügen Island, I was born at the Chalk-Cliffs, but she was born under the painting. But that's also not true, because she was born in 1908, and the painting was bought by her father in 1915. So it's a little bit a lie. But anyway, that's what she said. Okay. And this is the collector Oskar Reinhardt, who bought it in 1930. So the thing is, now you can say, okay, this is all nonsense material, maybe it's not interesting to research on, but it's interesting for the review of a painter, for example, that this painter was originally thought not to be Friedrich, and because it's in the beginning it was attributed to Karl Blechen. So now this is here. The second example, the Sea of Ice in 1823. You all may know, it's also in the catalogue, here in that catalogue, one of the also major pieces of Caspar David Friedrich. It was bought in 1905. In that case, we know quite exactly about the provenance, because it was always owned by the Dahl family. And Johann Christian Clausen Dahl, I already mentioned it, here is depicted by Karl Christian Vogel von Vogelstein in 1823, was, as I already mentioned, close friend to Friedrich. They lived in the same house in Dresden, and he had the painting from the beginning. But the story is not so easy as it sounds in the beginning, because here you have ice flows, which is a sketch, and you have another sketch. This is ice flows also, and you have a third one here. And they were regarded as ice flows painted by Johann Christian Clausen Dahl. But now they are this description is by Dahl himself. And Dahl said it's Caspar David Friedrich. Yeah? So he collected these and from Friedrich, and they are quite obvious when you see this ice rock, for example, and you have the painting. It's here, it's that rock. Yeah? Yeah. So you can see they are really sketches for the later painting. So that's another hint why object biography is so important. And in the first Catalogue raisonné, they were still a Dahl, and in the Catalogue raisonné by Helmut Bosch-Schuppan from 1973, they are. He was not very good in accepting this Helmut Bosch-Schuppan, but there were so many proofs that these are not by Dahl, that these are by Caspar David Friedrich, that he finally accepted them as original Caspar David Friedrich paintings. So, and let me see. Yeah, the thing is not that story with the Hamburg painting is not over, because the source of these ice flow sketches were not the Dahl family. I mean, I have to admit or to say that in 1905 it was, of course, not Dahl, because he already was passed away. It was the widow of his son who sold it to Hamburg. But this guy is Harald Friedrich, who was the only grandson of Caspar David Friedrich in the male line. He died in 1933, and he was also a painter, not maybe a very good one, but he was a good painter. Yeah. And he and his family, he was married and had one daughter who died in 1977. They sold a lot of paintings and drawings and sketches of her ancestor, Caspar David Friedrich. And also he owned these 3 sketches of the ice of the ice flows I already showed you. And the problem is that in his bequest you have a lot of sketches like that one. And this is around 1840, and it's said it's by Gustav Adolf Friedrich, who was the son. Harald is the grandson, Gustav Adolf is the son. You see, it's a Swedish name, yeah, Gustav Adolf, the big king. And but we don't know, and we only know that Alfred Lichtwark went to the collector, to the grandson Harald, and said, "Okay, I will buy for Hamburg that one, and I buy that one, but I do not want to buy that one. For example, that one." Yeah, and so they said it's Gustav Adolf. But you have not really proof, because Caspar David Friedrich never ever signed one of his paintings. He never did that. So it's totally not sure. Yeah? And maybe this is also a Caspar David Friedrich original. You don't know that. Yeah? And the thing is, you always judge that a good quality is an original by the painter, but that painters always have varieties in quality. You have also to think about, because Friedrich, for example, in 1835, 5 years before he died, he became a stroke, yeah? And after the stroke, he still was painting, but the paintings were not anymore so good. So you don't know exactly if this is also a Friedrich original. Or, for example, this caster in an auction house is also a bequest of Harald Friedrich. An auction house sent it to me, and it's really damaged by water and all that stuff. But you have very typical hints for Caspar David Friedrich. For example, the eyes here in the beginning. It also could be an original. You don't know that. There's still a lot of work to do with for the Friedrich research. My very last, and then I stop talking, is the famous Wanderer. That's interesting, because the Wanderer is from he was found in 1938 in a Berlin auction house called Knut. And you do not have any hint on that painting in letters, in archival material, or in somebody else. And it's so obvious, it's because it's a big one. Yeah, it's almost 1 meter here, that high. And it's whenever you have seen that painting, you will not forget that. Yeah, but there's not a single hint. And there were only people art historians who said this can't only be Caspar cannot only be Caspar David Friedrich because you have the Rückenfigur and all that. It's so typical for him. But this was a kind of, I said, old man's agreement. In 1938, Werner Zumowski and Karl Wilhelm Jänich, who said it's a Caspar David Friedrich. But there was no research, there was no X-ray, there was no research. And in Hamburg, the curators now say sometimes, it's not by Friedrich, it's by Carl Gustav Karus, but don't mention it. So we don't know that, but here you have Carl Gustav Karus, and he was also a contemporary of Caspar David Friedrich in Dresden. He was a student and an admirer, and he has this pilgrim guy in the Rocky Valley from 1828, or the Wanderer on the mountaintop in 1818. And here you also have a wanderer over the fog, over the mountains, watching over the mountains like a bird. So you don't know. And finally, we would like to have that as a Friedrich painting because it's one of the most important German Romantic paintings. But we are not completely sure. So that's it. Thank you very much.
So we thank Professor Heck for such a wonderful lecture, introducing us to object biography, which I think is much needed nowadays, that the teaching of art at our universities is far removed from objects and often sacrificed to preconceived ideas. I'm sure this very rich and stimulating lecture will provoke questions, but I kindly ask you to keep them until later, when we will have a session for questions. And we now move on to Dr. Knut Ljøgodt. As you know, Dr. Ljøgodt is, together with Carlos Sánchez Díez, the curator of the Visionary Romantics exhibition and the promoter of this collaboration between Spain and Norway at the Nordic Institute of Art, which he directs in Oslo. He studied art history at Oslo University, the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, and the Istituto di Norvegia in Rome, earning a PhD from Tromsø University. Before establishing the Nordic Institute of Art, Knut Ljøgodt was a curator at the Norwegian National Gallery in Oslo, director of the Nord-Norges Kunstmuseum in Tromsø, and founding director of the Kunsthal Slavard in Spitsbergen. As a specialist in 19th and 20th century Nordic and European art, he has published several studies, including a monograph on Peder Balke in 2020. He has also curated exhibitions such as the one on Peder Balke at London's National Gallery in 2014, and another one on Edward Burne-Jones, the Pre-Raphaelites and the North in Stockholm and Bergen in 2020. Most recently, he has co-curated a Peder Balke exhibition at the Finnish National Gallery in Helsinki, which just opened to the public last week. The paper he is delivering today is entitled Visionary Romantics, Balke, Lucas, Hertervig, and the Others. And I will now hand it over to him.
Thank you, José Luis, for your kind introduction. Good morning, everybody. Buenos días. I too would like to thank Professor Kilian Heck for his interesting opening lecture. The only challenge is that I now need to rework my own paper completely after listening to your interesting lecture. So, could we kindly postpone the seminar a few days? And perhaps we need a new edition of the book as well. The exhibition Visionary Romantics brings together the works of three 19th century artists: the two Norwegians, Peder Balke and Lars Hertervig, whose works, of course, you know well here in Stavanger, together with the Spanish painter Eugenio Lucas Velázquez. From two different countries and from different circles, there are no reason to believe that these three artists knew one another. Individual as they all were, they can, however, be seen as kindred spirits. They all sprang out from a romantic tradition, and they all focused, at least for periods, on landscape painting. They were, in my opinion, and which is also the thesis of this project, visionary artists depicting an inner rather than a real landscape. By juxtaposing their works, we wish to demonstrate how these artists applied experimental, innovative and highly personal techniques to give forms to their inner vision. And here starts the problems. Kilian, you already know this painting. I will, however, endeavor to continue along my own lines and our own hypothesis for this project. For the early Romantics, a landscape painting did not just represent nature, but also reflected the mind. And we can, of course, discuss to how large degree it was religious, was it Christian religious, more philosophical, as you have pointed out, Kilian. These ideas blossomed among the Romantics of the early 19th century, but they can be traced further back. Of particular importance was the concept of the sublime as an aesthetic category, defined by Edmund Burke around the middle of the 18th century as whatever excites the ideas of pain and danger, whatever is in so terrible, is a source of the sublime. The sublime was regarded as the opposite of beauty, often associated with the classical southern landscape, so new themes or different ways of looking at nature were required. And this stirred an interest in the horrible, and also resulted in artists, shall we say, discovery of new types of landscape, including the awe-striking mountains of both Switzerland and of the Nordic region. And among the early Romantics, landscape came, as we know, from, for instance, the poet Novalis, as a gateway to an otherworldly or spiritual dimension. The encounter with nature represents a connection to a cosmos or a kind of world soul. This transcendental worldview soon manifested itself in the works of painters and poets all over Europe. And in the paintings of the German artist Friedrich, who we now have had a splendid introduction to, this can sometimes be very explicit in its symbolism, as a cross appearing in the mountains, or the ruins of a church or an abbey in a forest, as we see here. In other works, the forces of nature manifest themselves through a shipwreck at sea, or the message is conveyed more poetically by the melancholy mood of a contemplative night landscape. And you mentioned Carl Gustav Kraus. He was, of course, also important because he was not only a painter, he was a physician, a scientist, and he wrote letters on landscape paintings that become an important document of the theory of landscape painter, where again he writes about these awe-striking qualities of the landscape. Climb to the topmost mountain peak, gaze out across long chains of hills and observe the rivers in their course and all the magnificence that offers itself to your eye. What feeling takes hold of you? There is a silent reverence within you. You lose yourself in infinite space silently. Your whole being is purified and cleansed. Your ego disappears. And Norwegian artists, such as Peder Balke, would encounter these ideals in Dresden. He studied with Dahl in Dresden, also knew the works of Friedrich very well, but they were very much alive all over Europe. For instance, in Düsseldorf, where Hertervig may have encountered them, and even across the Atlantic. And they are also reflected in the works of different artists such as Turner or Samuel Palmer in the United Kingdom, Britain. Outside landscape painting, the mysterious visions of William Blake or the fantastical scenes of Goya were pioneers of this current. And our three painters Balke, Hertervig and Lucas, can all, by different routes, be seen as part of this tradition. But there were also artists who took the tendency further and found new and different means, including technical means, to express what we have called their inner or spiritual landscape. Both Lucas and Hertervig will be present more in depth in other lectures here today. Lucas by Carlos Sánchez and Hertervig by Holger Koefoed. So I will here deal with the phenomenon in general, and for my own part focus more on Peder Balke, who will sort of serve as a case study. Now, Peder Balke is mostly associated with his paintings of the Arctic landscape, sometimes solemn, sometimes dramatic, inspired by his journey to the northernmost part of Scandinavia in 1832. Here we have a major work, Lighthouse in Mist, which is in the exhibition, and sort of shows him as an heir to Friedrich and the other Germans' visionary romanticism, but it also points in a new direction. After having studied in Díez, he would travel widely in Europe, prolonged stays in Paris, where he had a large commission from Louis Philippe, King of the French, and also in London, where he very likely encountered Turner's paintings. However, Balke was never fully recognized by the domestic art milieu in Norway at the time, and received some harsh critics. One critic stated that his works were of no artistic value, and that critic was associated with what you pointed out earlier, Kilian, the Düsseldorfer Schule. So of course it was sort of the battle between different generations, different schools of painting, different schools of thinking. The fact that Balke also was something of a social reformer, associated with the emerging socialist movement of Norway, probably did not endear him to the ruling classes. And around the mid-19th century, Balke stopped participating in official art life and did not exhibit his works anymore. However, he did continue to paint on his own for the benefit of himself and perhaps that of his immediate circle of friends, giving the works away. Most of the landscapes in this exhibition belong to this later period. By now, the artist had fully developed his manner of painting. The palette became more limited, and the composition centered around large surfaces as seen in Lighthouse in Mist. So, Balke's works, this is important, are not to be understood as topographical depictions, but as memory landscapes of the artist's encounter with the sublime Arctic nature, landscapes of the mind. Also, the works of Hertervig can be seen in this tradition. They are often inspired by the coastal nature or deep forests of his domestic region here in Rogaland, and are sometimes melancholy and gloomy in mood, such as old pine trees. Hertervig studied in Düsseldorf in the 1850s, where he could have encountered the romantic tradition of Friedrich, as well as perhaps the early works of Arnold Böcklin. And then our third musketeer, Eugenio Lucas Velázquez, specialized as a costumbrista or folklife painter, as well as a history painter and orientalist, and is sometimes seen as a follower of Goya. However, he had a much more varied production and also painted landscapes. These are often fantastic landscapes in the visionary romantic tradition, steep mountains, rough sea, dead trees. And here we continue with our problems. While some of the early romantics communicated the spiritual aspects through symbols, religious symbols for instance, artists like Balke, Lucas and Hertervig, I would claim, express this as much through form or technique. And this is the thesis behind the visionary romantics tradition. And of course then it's very tempting to show also Friedrich, his large surfaces that we also know from Balke. Of course we now know that there are supposed to be ships in the background of this, so it is not so much of a minimalist perhaps painting as we could call it. Still I think it serves its purpose to see in what direction romanticism could move. how would I translate the inner form, the inner vision into form? And even whether we know what this monk is thinking about or not, the isolation of the motif. Sometimes we will see a mountain appearing in the distance. That is, of course, a way of enhancing the visionary aspect of the landscape. And also this large surface, the almost monochrome use of colors. And this is something we know very well from the paintings of Joseph Mallard William Turner, who used exactly that, a limited palette, simplification of the composition in large surfaces. That goes especially for his later works. Turner was by this point, was of course a very famous artist in his time, but also controversial in old age, because of this, can we say, explosion of colors, experimenting with form. Often seen basically as studies in light and atmospheric condition, Turner's works also belong to a spiritual tradition. In his later works, however, the traditional allegories are gone, leaving the space to color and form, as we see here. And I also like to include one more work by Turner. This is a work painted originally in 1807 and reworked in 1849, which was one of the last years that Turner exhibited at the Royal Academy. And I show this because I think it's very likely that Peder Balke saw this at the Royal Academy. He was in London at the time, summer of 1849. We know he would go to all exhibition spaces, all museums, and of course he must have been fascinated by an artist like Turner, who were so occupied with similar motifs as Balke himself and similar ways of thinking about landscape. Now, building on such tradition, Balke would develop his own highly personal technique. On a grounded white canvas, paper, cardboard, or piece of wood, he would apply thin layers of paint, which he would then partly remove by the aid of a brush, a piece, or a cloud, or even his own fingers. Eventually his paintings would appear almost as monochromes, as we see here, and these elements, which has given the artist recognition in modern and contemporary times, were pointed out by critics in his own times as example of his lack of talent. Balke's works from the 1860s are dominated by pale surfaces, allowing the white grounding to shine through. Hertervig, on his side, will concentrate more and more on paper, watercolor, gouache, and drawing. They are sometimes executed on alternative types of paper, such as tobacco paper or wrapping paper, but I'm sure Holger will talk more about this. He too reworked old works, like we have seen Turner did. And I think his reworking of old works, use of unusual materials, perhaps because he lacked artist's material, demonstrate Hertervig's will to find means to express himself and constantly experiment and develop himself. And through this process he came to refine his technique for working on paper, also using color very skillfully, like we can see with Balke and Lucas. Another work. And of course Lucas. Eugenio Lucas, in his works of paper, is an artist who takes the abstraction to the landscape to the utmost degree, at least seen through modern and contemporary lenses. In his landscape gouaches, watercolors, and ink wash drawings, we see how the landscape is blurred and the form dissolves. This tendency is clear, for instance, here, or also here, where he used the staining technique extensively, as Carlos Sánchez discussed in his essay in the catalogue, and I'm sure he will talk more about it later. Another artist who would apply the staining method was Victor Hugo, the landscape, not only known as an artist, better known as a novelist, Notre Dame de Paris, Les Misérables, but who also was a draftsman, a printmaker, and worked extensively with art on paper. Many of these images were created during Ljøgodt's exile for almost 2 decades on the Channel Islands, working in solitude. The motifs are often old castle or coastal cliffs, or the wave as you see here, which through his floating technique appear blurred, giving them an air of mysticism in line with the Romantic tradition. Into the 70s, Balke would use more and more black on his paintings, very often small in size, as you will see in the exhibition, no larger than a cell phone or a postcard, very often painted on wood, and just adding the black painting on top of the white grounding, removing it, and making it appear almost as monochromes. And in this he comes quite close to what we see, for instance, in the works of Lucas and also Ljøgodt. The works by Balke, Hertervig, and Lucas discussed here were mainly executed for the artist's own intellectual pleasure. Some of these works have been referred to as sketches of studies, probably due to the relative small scale, as well as the loose painterly technique many of them are executed in. However, most of the works shown in our exhibition were probably never intended as sketches of studies, but, like the paintings of Turner, to be regarded as independent works of art. And that he sometimes would apply these techniques also to large-scale paintings bear witness to this. And I'm moving towards my conclusion. Balke and Hertervig were both to a large degree marginalized by the domestic art milieu of 19th century Norway, and for a long time ignored by art historians and institutions. Gradually, they gained recognition in Norwegian art history during the 20th century. Lucas, on the other hand, was a well-established figure in 19th century Spanish art, and there were also some international exhibitions in the mid-20th century. Later, however, Lucas' works have rarely been shown outside of Spain. So this is the first time in many years that he is here in Norway now. But how come that our 3 protagonists, all highly interesting and innovative artists, have been treated so uneven by history? Perhaps the answer lays exactly in the innovative aspect. Artists who do not fit into the narrative of traditional linear art history may soon find themselves on the margins of the canon of established art history. Because established art history tells us that Romantic movement revolted against ideals of Enlightenment and Neoclassicism, and was itself in due course replaced by Realism and Impressionist, and so on and so on. And not everybody fits into this narrative. As this project demonstrates, the dissolution of form and the technical experimentation this required appeared already in early mid-19th century, long before Impressionism, and are more to be regarded as an offspring of Romanticism, or rather one particular current within Romanticism, within the Romantic movement. Our overall ambition has been to map a relatively small group of artists of the early and mid-19th century who explored new and innovative ways of expressing their inner landscape. Some would call them proto-modernists. As a phenomenon, it took place parallelly in different parts of Europe and can thus not be treated as isolated incidents or belonging to national or regional art history. Rather, this should be seen as a transnational current, which I believe needs to be researched further. With Visionary Romantics, we attempt to place Hertervig, Hill and Lucas for the first time in this wider context, while we at the same time bring a little-known chapter of the 19th century European art history to the forefront of the discourse. So, just to sum up a bit, because this is a part also of the ongoing Hertervig project between Stavanger Art Museum and Nordic Institute of Art, in collaboration with different friends and institutions and colleagues, we of course look at new contexts to place Hertervig in, just as we have done with Balke and Lucas. So, Hanne Beate, next, about a year from now, Lars Hertervig will be shown alongside the Swedish artist Carl Fredrik Hill at Prinsesshjemmet Valdemar Skydde, and then the exhibition will come here to Stavanger. And I think it is appropriate to finish with Carl Fredrik Hill, because he is also an artist that demonstrates that this visionary tradition, this will to experiment, lives on well into the late 19th century. And with that, I will say thank you for the attention.
So we thank Dr. Ljøgodt for introducing the three artists of our exhibition and showing how, despite the fact that they never saw each other's work, they never were in each other's country, they shared some sort of common ground, which I'm sure we'll discuss later. It remains to be seen how much will Professor Heck's object biography affect the catalogue of Peder Balke. We saw Dr. Ljøgodt a bit in crisis, but maybe we'll end up discovering that these were not visions or imaginary landscapes, but what he saw from the window of his house, thanks to object history. Let's now move on to the third paper of this morning's session, which will be given by Carlos Sánchez Díez. He holds a postgraduate diploma of advanced studies in art history. Carlos works at the curatorial department of the Museo Lázaro Galdiano in Madrid, where he has been chief curator since 2022. Notable among his publications are those focusing on Spanish 19th century drawings, with studies on Valentín Carderera, Genaro Pérez Villamil, and Eugenio Lucas Velázquez, as well as Rosario Weiss. Of the last three, he has also staged exhibitions in Madrid. He has authored articles and monographs on the collections of the Museo Lázaro Galdiano and lectured at courses and conferences related to Spanish 19th century drawing and art. As co-curator of the exhibition with Knut Ljøgodt, the paper he's delivering today is entitled Eugenio Lucas Velázquez, From Goyaesque to Visionary Landscape. And I will now hand it over to him.
Good morning. Thank you, José Luis, for your nice presentation, and to thank everybody for being here. Eugenio Lucas Velázquez was born in Madrid in 1817, where he died in 1870. He was a painter who enjoyed commercial success with genre painting and landscapes of a romantic style, many of them former inspired by subjects worked on by Francisco de Goya many years earlier. Apart from Goya, who died in 1828, I don't think there is another 19th century Spanish art as versatile in subject matter, technique, and style as Eugenio Lucas Velázquez. For this romantic visionary exhibition and catalogue, we have selected Lucas' less classical works, the most audacious or visionary works in terms of method and way of representing landscape. However, the painter worked in different pictorial ways, which I allowed him to make a living with his art, and which I shall be briefly talking about now. I've always admired the diversity of his style, technique, and subjects. His catalogue covers a wide range, from the most classical genre painting, as you can see here in the two paintings on the left side, to the most experimental visionary landscape, as shown in the drawings on the right, both of them displayed here in Stavanger. This slide shows another two outstanding examples that attest to the variety I'm talking about. The one on the left is an interpretation of a Goya subject worked using the brush with black oil as if it were a pencil to draw the outlines of the figures. Our painter here is not copying a specific work by Goya, but is deeply inspired by elements of Goyaesque engravings, mainly the caprichos. In the second painting, the artist imagination and his hand worked together. He created this scene unfettered with large spots of colors, without any previous drawing, letting himself to be carried away by intuition and his good taste for the color on the effects of contrasting lights. Finally, to conclude this brief introduction, allow me to show you these two great and expressive works in which Lucas achieves a similar effects using different techniques and supports. In the one of the left, he first worked only with ink wash blots and then sketched the figures with brush and pen. In the second, in which we can read a critique of the control of priests over society, the subject takes second place by the expressive force of the moving figures, drawn in oil, the dramatic lighting, and the faceless characters forming a wild, swirling mass. As I said at the beginning, there is several artistic phases in Lucas. These 8 are the ones I have identified so far. This classification is not chronological. The imaginary landscapes made with the blood or stain technique were not only done at the end of his career, but he worked with this technique at least from 1850 until the end of his life, 1870. At the same time that he was engaged in other more classical productions. The genre painting, inspired by some Goya themes, was worked by Lucas mainly in oil canvas and some drawings with which he satisfies the high demand of this type of works in the art market at the time. These are technically excellent works in which the artist followed some of Goya's typical iconographies with a few changes. In the painting, we see on the screen Lucas, as Goya did in describing on the right, is also a social denuncier, in this case claiming against the unreasonable sentences handed down by the judicial system. Here we can see two paintings of inquisitorial subject matter. Although the Inquisition code had been abolished in 1834, in Lucas' time they were still of interest to collectors. In the painting on the left, Lucas was inspired by the composition by Goya, as can be seen in the work on the right. On the other hand, Lucas' works has a different, more diverse pictorial language, more texture, and perhaps a bit more drama. Bullfights are regularly featured in Lucas' production. In Plaza Partida, there is a great deal of fidelity to the Goyaesque painting, although he introduced elements already representative of the new romantic mentality, such as the detailed way of representing the popular types, with their traditional customs, gestures, and attitudes of the characters. The mass of the people who line the terraces of the bull ring allow Lucas to emphasize its grotesque character. In the arena, with the bloody bulls and the fight between the bullfighters and the animals, there is, however, a sense of the heartbreak more typical of romantic sensibility. Lucas sold these paintings very well in Spain and abroad, bullfighting, popular festivals, inquisitions, or religious scenes, often inspired by Goya prints and also by the famous black paintings, which Lucas appraised in 1855. These works often contain temperate social criticisms, more folklorical than real and evocative of an Spain of the past that is still interested to the art market. Portraits. Eugenio Lucas was not a prolific portraitist and generally followed a classical style, as we see on the left in his powerful self-portrait, considered one of the best of his production, elegantly dressed, proud perhaps due to his considerable success at the time, around 1860. However, as a curious artist, he also experimented with other more contemporary styles and techniques, as we can see in his small pastel self-portrait in the center of the picture, perhaps painted under the influence of his friend Alexandre Maria Roche, who had portrayed him in Paris with the same technique in 1852. Also, he experimented in the portrait of his friend, the painter Genaro Pérez Villamil, which is surprising for its sketchy style. Perhaps because of their close friendship, Lucas dared to innovate by using a very heavy and rugged brushstroke, something we will certainly not do for a client. I'm quite interested in this type of paintings, in which he documented political or social episodes of his times. The painting of the left above represents a violent and revolutionary episode, a military uprising followed by a popular insurrection in 1854. Lucas presented his painting in Paris and the Universal Exhibition of 1855, where it was briefly but favorably mentioned by Théophile Gautier. In the center, a popular cattle fair held in Madrid in 1856, and on the right, an scene from inside Parliament, an unusual in Spanish painting at the time, showing the plenary hall with a large audience in the gallery and in the foreground a small group surrounding two people who seem to be shaking hands in agreement. Below, two paintings showing the inauguration of the bringing of the water from the river Lozoya to Madrid on 24 June 1858, where the artist reflects the technological progress in the society at his time. As a decorative painting, his contact with the royal family resulted in the 50s commission to paint the ceiling of the Teatro Real in Madrid, Royal Theatre, as shown in the sketch on the left. He also decorated other palaces in Madrid, as we see in the sketch, with an allegory of spring. It is clear that this type of painting did not suit him. The artist repeats very, very conventional compositions from 18th and 19th centuries. Although Lucas did not travel outside Europe, he made some forays into Orientalist paintings, which was very fashionable at the time. On the left is a watercolor with he shows his capacity of invention executed using the block technique, later retouched with a brush. On the right is a canvas, both works on display here in the exhibition, which demonstrate his ability to imagine and also his dependence of the works of other artists, especially his close friend Genaro Pérez Villamil. Just a couple of examples to illustrate this important chapter of Lucas. On the left, this invented Tower in Ruins, a work you can see in the exhibition. It's a dramatic and a real landscape representing a famous mountain pass in the north Castile in Spain, considered to be Lucas' best landscape in the classical romantic style. Pérez Villamil's influence on Lucas can also be seen in these monumental architectural interiors, in which the influence of the Scottish David Roberts on Pérez Villamil is also evident. This remarkable chapter can only be illustrated with drawings, landscapes, and urban views made during his travels in France, Switzerland, and Italy in the summer of 1868, in the manner of a travel diary, watercolors in a realistic style. These drawings, like the imaginary landscape we will show now to finish, were not marketed during his lifetime. We know two groups of these travel drawings, one group of 50 works in the Museo Lázaro Galdiano in Madrid, and a similar lot in the National Library in Madrid. All of them came from Lucas' son, who was also a painter. We have arrived to the end of my talk. In this group of works, the most admired today, we find fascinating drawings made with ink wash, watercolor, or wash on paper. They are works far from figuration, in which the artist successfully combined his imagination, his skill, and the randomness of the technique used, the ink blot. They are landscapes, sometimes with sketched figures that blend in with nature or small ruined buildings. Here Lucas experiments with total freedom, outside the market, without limits. These works reinforced and enriched his artistic personality, placing him on a transnational level alongside other remarkable artists. Here Lucas shows the power of the nature and the insignificance of the man. He evokes and conveys a feeling of nostalgia and melancholy, perhaps his own state of mind, traits typical of the aesthetics of the sublime, also shared by Balke and Hertervig, his companions, his good companions in this exhibition. In these drawings of blots or stain, Lucas develops a progressive work of depuration that leads him to reduce his intervention on paper to a minimum, constructing landscape with brief monochrome stains. That seems to allude to mass of vegetation, clouds, or horizons. As can be seen in this last landscape on the right, which recalls Japanese ink stains, as we can see on the left of the composition here, made by Sesu Toyo, also made with a similar technique. It is very likely that these oriental echoes reached Lucas thanks to his visits to Paris, the center of the diffusion of Japanese art in Europe from the middle century onwards. I hope I have not bored you too much, hopefully interested. Any question will become, I know the answer, duly answered. Thank you very much.
Well, if I may, one of the things that has become clear after the papers is that there's a big contrast between the two Norwegian artists and the Spaniard, in the sense that whereas Lucas very much belonged to the mainstream and was part of the establishment all his life, and therefore we know a lot about what he did, who was he in touch with. The Norwegians, well, in one case he was completely an outsider, and in the case of Balke, after the first period of his career, pretty much so, which leads to the difficulties of studying them under this point of view of documentary art history. We know very little of the circumstances in which they produce the works. And I don't know if she's in the room, Inga Gudmundsson, who's writing her dissertation on Hertervig. She was just telling me yesterday at the reception that was kindly hosted by the museum how unlikely it is to find more information about these works. We were able to document the little episode in Spain as much as, as far as where the ship went to Malaga and the crime that was committed in Malaga, but we know very little about him, and that, of course, from the point of view of art history, makes a big difference in what we can say about the Norwegians and the Spaniards. I don't know if you want to take over.
Should I use this or this? Okay. I think it's a very important point and an interesting remark. I also think that, well, obviously for Lucas, he was officially recognized. Hertervig was, to a large degree, not. Balke holds sort of a middle position because he did exhibit up to around 1850. So he is documented. His works are documented to a certain degree. We know that he exhibited up to around 1850 in, for instance, the art societies in Christiania, Oslo, and other places. His memoirs are preserved, and also some letters, not many, but some letters and documents are preserved in the National Library, and we have a certain degree of provenance history. Also interesting to compare to Friedrich, also through Balke's family, his descendants. So when they sort of rediscovered Balke, if I may use that term, in 1914, very many of the works they found were still in the ownership of Balke's family. So we can follow the provenance of very many works, and we have notes on the backside referring to different exhibitions. So I think Balke perhaps is in a middle ground between the Lucas, who is very obviously very well documented and an official artist, and Hertervig, who is not so well documented always. But of course this is a challenge when you write about artists, but I think this project was also an attempt to place artists like Balke and Hertervig in a wider, not only Norwegian but European context, transnational context, to identify them with a certain group, this phenomenon we have called the visionary romantics. Whether they were visionary or not remains to be seen, Kilian. But and sometimes that is a method you can use, to show that these are not just oddities or outsiders in Norway, but they were actually European trained artists, and European in their ideas, and at the same time very individual. Don't know if that answered your questions, but there were at least some reflections around there. Should we send it on to?
Yes, I agree. You say Lucas, of course, has two parts in his life. The official Lucas, the recognized Lucas, is well documented. Yes, there are many things to read about him, but the more visionary landscapes works, we don't have anything, only a nice history that wrote an artist, a Spanish artist in early 20th century, who describes the technique that Lucas and his friend Pérez Bellamil used to his fighting artistic, that they used to meet together, to paint together, and to try how many works you can do in 30 minutes, for example. And these kind of methods are described and thanks to this man who wrote, we know how these are made. But these drawings were not very famous on 20th century. At the beginning, Lucas was completely out of the market, mostly out of the history of Spanish art, inclusive. Until 1922, in Madrid there was organized a big exhibition about the Spanish drawing from 18th century to 19, and Lucas, in this case, was revision and put in his place by Boix, and collector and historian of art of the drawing in Spain. And from them, Lucas has been recovered his place, and still in many persons as costume brims, is good painter, but in the last 20 years is more recognized as a great artist in this kind of works we have displayed here in the exhibition in Stavanger.
That was not a real question actually, but I think it reminds me what you said, Carlos, about Lucas. The idea why artists are forgotten for such a long time and then they will rediscovered. I mean, that's maybe a little bit simple-minded, but behind this simple question are so many aspects which we really should look on, because otherwise we simply do not understand why interpretations for a special time are interpretations which arise from the context of that time, and that they change. 80 years later you of course have a totally different view on these artists, and we all know about changing interpretations, but why they change to a specific time, influenced maybe by an exhibition or by a rising of a artist in the art market or something like that. It would be so useful to look more in detail on these phenomena.
Thank you. Can I ask about the blot and the improvised landscape, especially in the case of Lucas, but in the other artists too? In the 20th century, the improvised composition, the aleatory, becomes enormously important for artists like Hans Arp and then John Miro, and they have access to the ideas of suggestion and of Freudian unconscious. The spontaneity provides a portal into the unconscious. But for these artists in the 19th century, when they are working in this improvised way, is there a theory of the blot for them? Is there a theory of the improvised landscape, or do they treat it as a kind of exercise in virtuosity, like a musician might be thrown 3 chords or 3 notes and told, quick, make a composition? Is it a student joke, or is there a psychological theory that comes with that?
In my opinion, in the case of Lucas, he needs to express more than the market asks from him. And this way of expression over the paper with ink, wash, watercolor is the easy way, cheap way to do something to grow as an artist, to do his better as an artist. The market provides a life, money, house, but this kind of works provide other more intimate satisfaction.
I'm not sure if we can talk about the blot or the stain technique to the same degree in Peder Balke. They do, of course, have that appearance, but there are oil paints, first of all. They're not on paper like Lucas, but they still have, interesting enough, like they have the character of watercolors or even ink wash drawings or paintings. I think definitely they are not a joke in Balke's case. They are something he does for himself, but I think it's something he does for a real artistic and intellectual purpose. And I still believe that this is something to do with his inner landscape, because this is painted many, many years after his visit to the north. So this is his idea of depicting that landscape, and I think his work from 18 forwards to into the 1870s are a struggle, an attempt to give form to those ideas about that landscape. And sometimes that may, it has the appearance of spontaneity, but this is a technique that was well developed by Balke.
Okay. These three artists followed the kind of production that was not for sale. If they did for themselves, that's you. And my question would be to you, from the Friedrich background, from Ljøgodt. Did they have a similar way of guarding something for themselves, doing it in a way that we see with Friedrich and Balke? Is that so?
I mean, the normal perspective on Friedrich is that he was like a monk in his studio and did not care about the world outside. So he was totally dedicated, I mean, that's the interpretation. He was totally dedicated to his art and did not care about selling things and stuff like that. So that was a kind of interpretation who makes him to an artist who is not influenced by the so-called business world at all. But I do not agree with that. So I completely think he was part in his life, he was open for other aspects like wandering with friends, having conversations. We have very few personal sources written by him, but there's a late source aspects over other artists. And then in this paper, he had bad words for a lot of other artists and words which are not very politically correct. So he was much more than only a monk who was inside his studio and did not care about the outside world. And for example, we're talking about music. We have really interesting works. They are not well known in the Friedrich research with music. For example, Shretchin was a Russian admirer and collector of Friedrich, and for Shretchin, Friedrich produced, we say in German, transparent paintings. So you could have light behind the painting. They were not on canvas, of course. They were on material you could look through. Yeah. So and then you had music, a harp player, for example, in the background, and different kinds of lights which changed, darker and brighter, and so on, so that the painting, so-called painting, the picture became vivid in a way, including music. And that's a total contradiction about the painting monk theory, yeah, because he was much more obvious to the modern techniques of how to show pictures, how to make them vivid. It's an early form, I will not say cinema, but it's a pre-form of giving something to the audience and to catch the audience for these specific art. Yeah.
Or rather, it's a partly comment, partly question to Kilian, to your lecture. You are now. This is a re-evaluation of how we look at Friedrich, I think. We are used to see him this soul painter of the soul, but didn't he say something along the lines himself that an artist has to see what he sees inside himself rather than what's in front of him? And he adds a bit sarcastically, and if he doesn't see anything inside himself, he shouldn't paint at all. And was that just a pose then?
No, he said this. He definitely said this, but the thing is, you really collect only the quotes which are useful for your interpretation. And the other quotes you let outside. And that's exactly what happened to Friedrich. Yeah, I just quoted these late paper written on what are the other artists. Yeah, and he claims and uses words like I wouldn't repeat that here because they are really nasty. Yeah, and that's so untypical for him. Yeah, in a way, untypical for the stereotype of what is Friedrich. Yeah, so that's the only thing. He is both, and of course, the other thing I wanted to mention is that we all have the idea of a perfect quality painter, and we do not agree that a painter, especially after an illness or so, is not that genius painter or drawer anymore. That there are also varieties in the quality of an oeuvre. Yeah? But you have to see that aspect. It's so obvious for so many artists, but the market says, okay, this is so bad, it could not be by or by and that's something we really should, if we would like to come back to a kind of sophisticated connoisseurship, yeah, we really should be aware of that aspect.
Now that Kilian Heck has brought up the art market as a topic, which is a different way to look at these artists, I think one thing that has become clear through these papers is the big contrast in the sheer quantity of works that these artists produced. We've seen how Lucas is capable of many different manners and in high numbers of so his output is quite phenomenal, uneven, and whereas Balke and especially Hertervig produced a much less important quantity of works. But now the irony of the market is that whereas Lucas in Spain and internationally is not a sought after artist, and you find quite a lot of by him and at relatively very low prices, we are witnessing how Peder Balke is becoming a sort of international star in the art fairs, and museums are after his works. And perhaps here's the author of his Modern Fortune. He would comment on that.
Well, that's a dubious characteristic, I would say, ambitious. So you say it's my fault that nobody can afford a Peder Balke painting anymore. Well, obviously, there has been an increased interest in his works after the different international exhibition. That is what happens, and we might see that when it comes to Hertervig. Of course, with Hertervig, he has a very limited production. Perhaps Hanne Beate or Holger can comment on that later. And also, I think Friedrich had a very limited production, or is that also a myth? Okay, another myth that you will punctuate. But I think Balke is more productive than we have recognized. I think because new paintings turn up quite a lot because of the market, and there are very many of them are, I think, come from reliable sources. They have a reliable provenance, and they are also interesting and good paintings, many of them. So I think the catalogue raisonné for Peder Balke will be a greater challenge than I had thought, because new paintings turn up. And now I also seen the criteria by Professor Heck, what you need to research for a catalogue raisonné. So I will probably need the next 100 years for that. So you would like to comment on it?
In the case of Lucas, for me, it's impossible to know how much works he did. 100 and 100, we have documented almost 500 drawings, more than 500, and paintings, more than 300. We are discovering year after year more and more, because he was a very quickly artist. I don't know. You want to say?
So you would like to know the number in the catalogue raisonné? Good question.
bit smaller now that you are re-evaluating Friedrich.
Uh-huh.
There will be less paintings.
Yeah. I guess you have one problem with Friedrich. You have drawings and you have paintings, but you have the so-called in German bildmäßige Zeichnungen. So these are all sketches. You don't know exactly what is their status. Are they more drawings or are they more paintings? Yeah, you have a lot of them, but in all, you have about 300 paintings and oil sketch which look like paintings, and you have 800 drawings like that. Yeah, that's the amount. I would say it's not such a small oeuvre. It's I mean, in comparison to Picasso with 18,000 numbers, it's limited, of course, but it's quite an amount. Yeah, I would say. Yeah.
Going back to how important the provenance and the history of collecting is for the study of an artist, a thing which was decisive in the case of Lucas and we don't have in the case of the Norwegian artist is a big collector acquiring in bulk 175 works from the son of the artist. So Lázaro Galdiano buys Lucas in big quantity and starts promoting him, organizes shows in Munich, in Paris, starts producing literature about him, and that has been the origin of, his critical fortune in Spain. There's no such thing, if I'm correct, in the case of the Norwegians.
Well, again, it's probably true when it comes to Hertervig, but for Balke, of course, there were no Lázaro Galdiano who bought all of his oeuvre and gave to a museum, alas. But Balke had his champions. When he was first shown in 1914, he died in 1887, forgotten as an artist, and there were people who collected him. I mean, some of the museums acquired his works, but also the then national antiquarian Harry Fett bought quite a number, and also published an extract of Balke's memoirs in the 1920s. So he was one of the early champions for Balke's art, and there have been similar among not only art historians and curators, but I will say among collectors and also artists. Artists have always had an eye for both Hertervig and Balke. As for collectors, there has been like a stream of dedicated collectors. One very important was my now departed friend Asbjørn Lunde, an American collector in New York of Norwegian origin, who was perhaps one of the first in modern times who collected Balke systematically and sort of already in the 1960s. So he was a very important collaborator for me when we started to work with Balke internationally. So there are some, but not to the same extent.
But you forgot the king.
Yeah, well, of course he sold. You mean the king of the French? Yes, he had a big commission from King Louis Philippe in the 1840s. He painted first to he managed to get access to the king. So he had this ability in his own lifetime to persuade patrons. Also, the king. We had joint kings with Norway and Sweden at the time. They purchased his works, but not as much as the French king. That is right. So he commissioned a series of sketches. First he bought 2 finalized finished paintings. Then he commissioned a series of sketches from which he wanted to choose, because the king had himself traveled to Scandinavia, to the northernmost parts of Norway, and also of Sweden and Finland. Unfortunately for Balke, there was a new revolution in 1848, and the king fled the country to England. But the sketches a series of sketches are preserved and on display in the Museo du Louvre. And it was also fortunate in another way, because Balke went after the king to England, and that's when I believe he saw the works of Turner. So it's all interesting.
Yeah, but I would like to focus on these phenomena of the art market. That's so interesting how that works, especially in the case of Friedrich, that he was in 1906 became a kind of review has had to do with the rising of, you would not, you are wondering about that, it's Van Gogh, because Julius Meyer-Gräfe was responsible for the Van Gogh review in Germany. Germany was one of the first countries where museums collected Van Gogh. Around 1900, nobody cared about Van Gogh paintings, and the wife of Theo, Van Gogh's brother, she was the woman who brought Van Gogh in the market, and she wrote to the museum's directors letters and so on. And around 1900, the German museums were in the beginning not interested in Van Gogh at all, and then they started to collect. For example, we in Kreisstadt, we have one Van Gogh painting, and the second one, which also could cost 200 Reichsmark, 200 for Van Gogh, was too expensive, so they didn't bought the second one. They got offered. Yeah, it's really an interesting thing. But the Friedrich phenomenon has to do with Van Gogh in that aspect, that he was created by Meyer-Gräfe as the new hero of the Northern artist, which became problematic in the 1920s and 30s because this turns out to be racism. But in the beginning, Van Gogh was the opponent of the Southern artist, Italian artist, because he was whatever, red hair, blonde, whatever, and so he was regarded as a component. And Friedrich happened exactly the same in that time. Yeah. He was the component of the Northern artist, and so he was a kind of to be interested, because he was not such typical Italian artist, whatever. Yeah. So this is was also part the biography of the artist, to make to rise up the value of the paintings. So this also has to do with each other. So there are a different, partly odd aspects you have to be aware of when you are talking about why has a special artist a good time in 1906, why he had a bad time in 1860 or so.
So as we draw to a close, it is perhaps time for a last question from the audience. Anyone? No? Well, thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers.
So everybody, welcome to the second session of the seminar, which I will moderate. While we during the first section talked about the visionary romantic as a phenomenon in more general terms and its background in European history, we were also introduced to the oeuvre of Caspar David Friedrich, which has caused some debate about attributions. Some told the Professor Heck during the lunch break that her heart was broken after hearing this. So this should call for an interesting debate at the end. And we also introduced to Eugenio Lucas' work, put in a larger context, as well as that of Balke. In the second part, we will concentrate on Lars Hertervig, who of course came from this region, from Borge and Stavanger, and whose works are so central to the collection here at Stavanger Art Museum, as Hanne-Beate told you about in her introduction. Which place does Hertervig have in the narrative of the visionary romantics, and indeed which place does he have in the history of art, or the canon if you like? To help us look closer at Hertervig, we are fortunate enough to have two leading experts in quite different fields. And I am very happy to introduce the first speaker of this session, Magister Holger Koefoed, who was my colleague in the National Gallery many years ago, and we did have a lot of fun back in those days. Holger is an art historian from the University of Oslo on a thesis on Lars Hertervig's art, published from 1972, and as such a pioneer in the research on this artist. He was many years head of the educational department at the National Gallery, and for a period also held the same position at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Oslo. Koefoed is a well-known person to the Norwegian audience, He has led several cultural programs on NRK TV, and in addition he has taught art history and theory at the National Academy of Arts in Oslo. He has published a number of books on Norwegian art from the 19th and 20th century, including his 2 books on Lars Hertervig from 1984 and 2002. And with no further ado, I leave the stage to you, Holger. Varsågod.
Thank you, Knut. This is a very interesting day, and I'm glad so many survived the lunch. It's always difficult being the first after lunch, you know. But here we go. Today, I'm going to talk about Hertervig's possible connections with the Quakers and their ideas. I mean, he was no Quaker himself. His father was a Quaker, his mother, and he came from a family with many connections to the Quaker movement. Here in Stavanger, they were called the Society of Friends, and they were basically English-based. And Hertervig, he lived with his father, and even his first training as an artist happened here in Stavanger at a Quaker leader, Asbjørn Kloster's afternoon school, where he learned drawing lessons before becoming a professional artist. So he's very tight in the beginning. And afterwards, when he came back from Düsseldorf first time, he was an oarsman for a famous British Quaker who visited this region and gave a lot of speeches, or they don't talk so much, but they had meetings all over this part of the region. And he was an oarsman, carrying him around in this boat. And so he has had strange connections with the Quaker movement, you might say. The only problem with the Quakers and art is they hate art. They think this is just luxury. It's it's just too much for your ego, people seeking art. So they're all against it. And Hertervig's parents, they were of course negative to the idea of their son being an artist, because they wanted him to stay in Stavanger, but he wanted to be so and go to Christiania and Düsseldorf. And he tried to calm down his parents by saying, well, either I'll be a famous artist or I'll not make enough money to buy bread. And they were Quakers, so they meant poverty was a better option than, not failing on your vocation or your call as an artist. Because for the Quakers, the inner light, or the light within, as you might call it, that was in something inside everybody. That was God's place in the inside of you. And everyone had this. And this was a place where you could consult God. And for the Quakers, when you had a vocation like Hertervig, this would be something that the Godhead would really approve. This was the inner connection. So they respected this, and that's why I think they let him go to Christiania and Düsseldorf. Now, you might say, if he was this connected to the Quaker movement, not personally, but just the ideas, what they were doing, what would the Quakers like about art? I mean, if they had to really look at it. Well, there are a few things. Firstly, that it was a gift from God through the vocation, to your call. And secondly, that meant that you had to be very personal in questions of doing your art. What makes you different from everybody else is the meaning of your vocation as an artist. No? So that means, for instance, you should not follow fashion or general trends. You do your own thing. It's the as you said, the visionary inner life of the artist that's important. They were also fiercely against realism, partly because you can't copy the creator. And realism, that's for everybody. You're supposed to be very personal in your engagement in art. So that was the idea. They were also against, as I said, luxury. Luxury paintings made for the walls of the rich, very bad. And how they would say something like, how can you sell something that comes to you as a gift from God? difficult. So let's say their ideal would maybe more like folk art, something useful and something that's everyday, connected to everyday life. But Hertervig, he had his own way of doing things, as we shall see. What the Quakers sought in art, they sought meekness, innocence. They were against war, against alcohol, against slavery, against mistreating of animals, etc. All these were central themes for the Quaker movement here in Norway also. So Hertervig is part of all this. And we might see in, you see in his portrait here, he's looking upwards. And that might be an indication that he is, normally that would mean he has some religious feelings or sentiments. Or maybe it's just a way of characterizing somebody who's interested in the higher regions, like cloudscapes. We don't know. I think so. That it tells us something, but of course we have very few written things about the artist, so we have to look closely at his art, and it gives us some ideas. This one also is in the catalogue. It's an impossible self-portrait. Very strange picture, actually, because he has lowered his hat in front of the eyes, concealing the eyes. And we see the two coastal ferry boats leaving. That means they're leaving Stavanger, and he's staying behind. And we don't really know what's happening, because there's some strange musical notes down to the right there. But if you look closely at his lips, it looks as if he is whistling. And we know about Hertervig, his sister said that he was whistling when he was very happy. It's something he really liked. So why should he be so happy here? This is from the year 1858. He just came back from 1.5 years at the mental asylum, where he couldn't paint, or where he wasn't cured even. And now he could start afresh. But he didn't have to follow the style of his sponsors, and he didn't have to follow the latest trends in Düsseldorf. He was free to follow his inner visions. And he's made some very interesting, in the same sketchbook, very small sketchbook, he's made a series of very beautiful cloudscapes, like this one. They seem like happy moments, and even sketches from the life on the streets and markets in Stavanger, like this one, even with a humoristic touch. But I love the people looking for the ferry boat, or the boat in the background there. He also, the same year, 1858, this is very interesting, he has about 20 sketches in the large sketchbook. It's not very large, but it's called the large, that have reference to Düsseldorf. This is 4 years after he was dead. It's written on them, painted after memory in Stavanger. 4 years after he was there, he left the city, or fled from the city, you might rather say. And these are very strange visions of Düsseldorf. Here under this one it says Mühlenstraße, that's one of the main streets in Altstadt in Düsseldorf. A Düsseldorfer's fear, it's written. And it's probably, they experienced often that the Rhine flooded, Hochwasser, but that's not what this picture is about. You see some people in the boat there by this small island, and somebody's pointing to what's going on in the background, and it's as if palaces and houses are turning into ruins and back to nature again. Very strange. Look at the buildings to the left. There's even some churches, but this is something happening, and the people in the boat don't seem to matter, It's very strange. And here's another one that's very beautiful, I think. It's this one from Grafenberg. That's one of the places where the students often went to make studies and sketches in the surroundings of Düsseldorf. And it's written here, Grafenberg. There are no people, no happy clouds in this series. The sky is empty. So this is a place, a negative place, you might say, for Hertervig in this year. The I think it has something to do with the Quaker notion of Babylon being the city of greed, the city where money reigns and man's ideas, and not the city of God like Jerusalem. James Backhouse, he talked about this on his speeches around in this region, and so maybe he picked up something there, and he's in a way he's kind of making the destruction of Düsseldorf in these sketches 4 years later, and maybe he's trying to work on this his own. Well, maybe he felt he was destructed in Düsseldorf in the same way. Maybe it's a way of rethinking what was going on, and maybe letting this be something behind him. Very interesting paintings in the sketchbook, what things we see here. He has also more landscape paintings. This one has a small church in the background now. To the Quakers, churches were no good. They were made by man, and they were not, the place where you could meet God, because God was spiritual places, like in nature, like inside your body. That's where you find God. But he has this, it's very common way of underlining the supernatural dimension of the landscape. And you have this, I think it's a little bit like a Friedrich, but in a very Hertervig way of working, but without the wanderer. You have the path, and you have the cloudscapes in the background with a landscape, typically romantic, and this is something he's been refining eventually, but it's a spiritualized landscape, absolutely. Now, 10 years after he returned from the asylum, something new happens in his art. And this is from 1865. It's a very detailed and interesting oil painting. The landscape is very, how should we put it? It's like a Urlandschaft. It's, very old, it looks like, with the trees and here. There's even a hunter here in the middle of the mist here. There are some birds rising up that he doesn't see. And the strange thing here, it's very dark, melancholy, moody landscape, but there's something which is very different, and that is, of course, the clouds, as you all see. They are actually very virtuoso, made splendid. It's exactly as if you see the clouds are evaporating, changing right in front of your eyes. So it's a very strange. It's melancholy. It's dark, but there's something else happening. And that is maybe the spiritual dimension as a position to all the melancholy that's left in the landscape still. Now, one of his greatest paintings is from Borgøya, the island where he was born. And many people have written about this. Inger Gudmundsson in the catalog has a very good text on the painting. And I'll try to put it in a Quaker context, because this is the place of birth of Lars Hertervig, and it's the home place for the Hertervig family. And the father, he liked this painting a lot, so he kept it, and they had it in their living room in the Hertervig house here in Stavanger. But what I'm trying to read this now as a Quaker statement. And what could we find here? Well, first important thing is that it has nothing to do with realism. This island doesn't look like this from any angle. So that's first very important step here. And the things he has underlined and made important in the painting is, of course, the cloudscape and the light coming all the way down into the foreground. And even the foreground is connected to the background here by, you see the same forms as you have in the clouds and in the islands here. They reflect each other in a way. So it's a very interesting painting in this way. So to Hertervig, I think he here is trying to make a painting that would be on terms with his own personal way of thinking and working as an artist. The island is coming out of the clouds, and the light and everything is dominating, and it's, maybe you could say, this is seen as through the inner eye. And of course, maybe both. I think Hertervig would like to focus on both. As Friedrich, you have to have both. You have to observe nature, and you have to have the eye within, the soul's eye, working in your art. Here maybe more of the inner eye dimension. You might even say that this is like a landscape without a landscape, because it's all these spiritual elements that have taken over. Not realism, but all the other things that are important to him. So in this way, maybe his father and others that were Quakers would find this interesting, even if it doesn't look like their home island. We have a critic, Tromans, he's here today also. He has written beautifully about this painting, and I like a lot. I'll read just a little bit. I quote from him: "It is the moment before the dream evaporates and the everyday life is installed afresh." In Norwegian, det øyeblikket før drømmen fordamper og hverdagen vender tilbake. So it's just this moment before you awake. And I think the idea here would be very in touch with what Hertervig was trying to do, was to show both the inner and the outer eyes work at the same time. See? And to me, I think this is a painting that must have taken hours and days of looking and staring. Now, when Hertervig was at the asylum, he was asked why was he ill? What has happened to you? And he answers in a very strange sentence. He says, well, his illness had come from staring observation of landscapes in sunshine. Staring observation. What is that? Well, to me, it's kind of this double vision that we've been talking about with Friedrich and many of the Romantic artists. So here, I think to work in this way, you have to have used a lot of time just with stillness and this staring observation before painting this. And you might say he's been learning the motive here, inside out, and painting it from the inside. So it's very strange. Here, I think Hertervig wanted here to give birth to something spiritual, and probably that's why it's been such a popular motive ever since. Okay, good. We have to chase on a little bit. I'll show you just a few things that happened with Hertervig. This is how he worked 11 years earlier. It's just for the contrast. Düsseldorf, Moody. And this is a small sketch from the 1870s, which might show Hertervig as this strange tree here. He looks upon himself as something very different from the other trees that they can be useful. But this fellow is very strange, okay? We don't know. And he starts working on, collects paper like tobacco paper, and works like this, as you see. And only from the 1870s, only works like this. And the strange thing is that from this paper he cuts and makes a kind of a paper out of, from these backgrounds of chaos, you might say, he sees a motive coming, emerging, and then he makes it. So there's an indirect contact between the chaos of the material part of this work and the fragility, the transparence of the motive. I think he would like that. And for a Quaker, also, the primeval forest would be a place where you could experience the nature of the creator, okay? And this is a way of ridiculing maybe military parades. They look like tin soldiers that have been fallen over. And here you have a speaker, maybe from a spiritual house. Very strange architecture. And here also, the Whore of Babylon, it's called. It's not a good reproduction, but I think it has something to do with the crisis in Stavanger. You see her with a glass of wine. She was, all the rich and the famous, they loved her, but when there was really a financial crisis, they got bad dreams. And you even have a small bed in the foreground here with somebody sleeping, unfinished boats, and people hiding in the mountains, etc. It's very personal. And we have this strange picture called the Red Pavilion. And I think I have found, there are many theories about what this is. I made mistakes with it. And I found a text that I'll try to just to read a little bit for you. It's not a Quaker text, actually, but it's like Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, the most widely read book in the 19th century Norway after the Bible, okay? And this text is it's an oligarchical text about a boat, the Pilgrim, with the captain Will steering at the ship, and the ship's pilot, he was called Mr. Conscience, and the ship owner's name is Mr. Heart, and the two helmsmen are Mr. Thought and Mr. Feelings. And the journey is through the rugged life of sea, where they visit different islands. This is the first island, Funland, where there's a lot of entertainment, and they're, of course, on their way to paradise. So this is the boat. You see it in the background here, and the people are coming up, and you see only the heads. Very strange. You see circus animals, people on stage, strange things going on, a lady with a harp. So we don't really know what it's about, but if it's this island, Funland, it says in the text that, well, people were so eager leaving the boat to have all this entertainment, you know, it's before television and stuff. So they just were like zombies walking into this area. And they didn't even notice that it was quicksand. So they all sank into the ground and disappeared. And many of them died on this island and couldn't continue their trip to paradise. So this is kind of a popular religious story that might have inspired Hertervig here. And as I said, it's not a Quaker text, but it's very interesting. They might have liked the, the moralistic aspects of the view here, that entertainment is negative. I'm soon finished. And it's not perfectly good, but it's a winter scene here from Stavanger with the stone fences, and there's a cloud in the horizon there with the sun showing up here. A winterly scene. And Hertervig, he was known in this town because he could stop people just to show them a beautiful sundown or a beautiful cloud or something. He wanted to show them the real thing. And that might be part of his problem as an artist, working with physical colors and paint and stuff. So, this Hertervig's new approach to art, and that is his real, what shall we say, his real visionary aspect comes to life when you see his way of working with rubbish, with things people throw away. And this he did from the 1870s. And we have the Dada in the modernist movement, of course, 40 years later or even more. They also used rubbish, but that was as an anti-art project. They wanted to go against the bourgeois art scene by using cheap materials. And maybe this is also an idea Hertervig had, but I don't think he was anti-art, but he had a very personal way of doing it. And there is a modernist critic and artist called Roger Fry, from one of the most famous Quaker families in England. And he was so critical of the bourgeois art, the whole thing. and the pseudo art, as he called it, and he wanted people to work maybe more like Hertervig, from the inside out and in a very personal way. So I think maybe it's possible Hertervig had some ideas that the Dadaist would like, but we really don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. That was some mind-blowing images you showed, and also some very striking arguments you gave us. Food for thought. I think it certainly did enhance this idea of the visionary artist. And I also think your point that artists could be, both be observing nature, being naturalists, but at the same time depicting an inner or visionary landscape. I think that's a good one that probably applies to several, to for instance, Balke and Lucas as well, and perhaps even to Caspar Friedrich. Nick has extensively researched the topic of artists and mental illness, and he is currently working on a book about the historical relationship between art and psychiatry, as well as on an exhibition of the works of Richard Dadd for the Royal Academy in London. And thinking of the personal history also of Lars Hertervig, we are thrilled that Nick is here today to talk about Dadd and Hertervig, private lives. Nick, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Knut, for that generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation to you, Knut, and to Hanna Beata. And I do feel very self-conscious coming all this way from London to preach to you in Stavanger about your artist, Hertervig. So I feel extra grateful to Inga Gudmundsson, who helped me get started in understanding a bit more about this fantastic artist. And in fact, since I arrived in Stavanger just a few hours ago, late last night, I've already learned a huge amount more from Holger, just in chats over a drink and breakfast. So it's amazing what you can learn through travel. This wonderful exhibition, Visionary Romantics, brings together the work of 3 19th century artists who did not know one another, or we assume each other's work, but who nevertheless share enough for their juxtaposition to evoke multiple echoes between them. There is no one history here or single proposed narrative. There are several. And I have been left thinking how well this model suits our times in which we no longer believe in one definitive history of art. Rather than being fitted within or excluded from a genealogical diagram of art historical development, within which relationships are typically restricted to a single definitive point of contact, master-pupil, pioneer-follower, placing artists in parallel or apposition to one another allows for a far more subtle set of connections to be traced. In that spirit, I would like to recruit a new member to this virtual fraternity of artists to make another step sideways, as it were, and introduce Richard Dadd to place alongside Lars Hertervig. Both of these artists, who would never, I assume, have heard the other's name, suffered debilitating mental illness and were, as a result, excluded from the professional art world for most of their lives. That is the connection between them. To propose such an analytical pairing of mad painters, quotation marks, seems perhaps romantic, sentimental, even to the point of amateurishness. Are we simply going to look through their oeuvres and find eventually two pictures that look a little bit like each other, like these two boats, and say, aha, this is the common element of the mad artist. This is what mad artists do. Well, I hope not. Yet, despite that kind of methodological hesitation, squeamishness, I am encouraged by the context of visionary romantics to feel able to compare the professional, psychiatric, and reputational narratives of Hertervig and Dadd without seeking to force those narratives into a single story. So allow me to briefly introduce Richard Dadd to those of you who may not be familiar with him. And you would be forgiven
if you did not know much about his work, as sadly very few of his works are to be found anywhere beyond Britain or America. An important exception to that generalization is, however, this wonderful illustration to A Midsummer Night's Dream in the Louvre, one of the Shakespearean subjects with which the young Dad made his reputation in London in the early 1840s. The youthful Dad was perceived as exceptionally brilliant, charming and vivacious, but tending perhaps to the extravagant in his visual imagination. In 1842, in his mid-20s, Dad embarked on an arduous, year-long voyage around the Mediterranean as artist companion to a wealthy tourist. Seen on the left, he made endless, beautiful, microscopic miniaturist drawings like these studies of Malta on the right. And the intensity of the experience of this trip and the intensity with which he worked throughout it triggered a psychotic illness involving delusions which tragically led the young artist, after his return to England, to kill his father. Very tragic case. Dad was placed under custody in secure mental asylums for the remainder of his life. 20 years at Bethlehem Hospital in central London, and then 22 years at Broadmoor Hospital in the countryside outside the capital. Dad continued to make work. Primarily, initially, memories of his eastern journey, such as this ambitious watercolour of an encampment on the shores of the Dead Sea. But things changed drastically for him in the 1850s. In the early 1850s, drastic changes were made in the management of Bethlehem Hospital, where he was a patient, to bring this literally medieval institution up to date. And bringing it up to date meant adopting the guidelines for the running of asylums originally laid out by the Tuke, T-U-K-E, the Tuke family of York, a prominent Quaker dynasty at the beginning of the 19th century. Indeed, the humane, institutionalized care of the mentally ill was generally recognized as a Quaker innovation. Of course, an intriguing backstory when we consider Hertervig's Quaker context here in Stavanger, which we've just been hearing about from Holger. But to return to Dad. From the 1850s, he was given greater encouragement by the authorities at Bethlehem to revisit his love of Shakespeare, most famously with his Fairy Fella's master stroke, begun in 1855 and inspired by the famous account of Queen Mab in Romeo and Juliet. It is now, by a very long margin, Dad's best-known work, and I am absolutely not going to get bogged down in it, otherwise we shall never move on. But essentially the story concerns... Do I have a laser? Let's not even bother with that. The story basically is that Queen Mab, the queen of the fairies, who wants to zip around the world, seeding fantasies and the unconscious dreams of people, can't get about her business because her hazelnut chariot is broken, and so somebody has to cleave into a hazelnut to make a new chariot for her, and everybody's waiting impatiently for the hazelnut to be cracked and the chariot to be fitted, and she, Mab, to continue her nocturnal wanderings. As well as these ambitious paintings, such as the Fairy Fella, Dad also continued in the 1850s under this newly inspirational relationship he seems to have developed with his doctors. He continued to execute an extended series of some 30-something works entitled The Passions. Here are two examples, reflecting upon the causes and symptoms of mental anguish. So the patient, the psychiatric patient, becoming the surveyor, the cataloguer of mental illness. And also, interesting from a point of view of comparison with Hertervig, Dad started to make, or continued to make more ambitious, these small, fantastic landscapes executed in a miniaturist stippling technique, as in the sublime yet miniature Port Straglin of 1861. And I've deliberately left the British Museum's scale there so that you can see that, as is the case with some of the beautiful works by Hertervig in the exhibition, this work by Dad is literally the size of a postcard. Now, assuming that Lars Hertervig does not require, for this audience, such an introduction, let's press on to ask what might we learn by placing his, Hertervig's, and Dad's lives alongside one another. First, some important differences become immediately apparent. Their social background. To begin with, Hertervig was born into a rural family who fell into poverty, and he received very little academic education. Dad, born 13 years earlier in a large southern English town, was the son of a prosperous chemist with intellectual ambitions. Robert, Dad, the father, ran his own private museum and sent his son to grammar school until the age of 14. Hertervig was apprenticed to a house painter while still a child, beginning his formal art studies in Christiania in 1850, aged 20. Dad is thought to have studied with a miniaturist before becoming a student at the Royal Academy Schools in London in 1837, also aged 20. To us, now, Hertervig is an entirely, as far as I understand, wordless historical figure. Anything I say about Hertervig stands to be corrected immediately afterwards by all the experts in the room. But as far as I'm aware, Hertervig is a largely wordless historical figure. We have only his pictures. Dad, meanwhile, enjoyed wordplay, and his surviving writings are a crucial element of his legacy. With regard to words, both artists have also been ventriloquized by literary figures, their hidden inner lives imagined in literature, famously by Jon Fosse in the case of Hertervig, and by Isaure de Saint-Pierre and Jennifer Higgy in the case of Dad. Other than their social backgrounds, the other fundamental difference between the lives of Hertervig and Dad lies in the length of their hospitalization. 42 years, as I've outlined in the case of Dad, 18 months at the newly opened Gaustad asylum just outside Christiania in the case of Hertervig. Dad had progressed much further than Hertervig in their common profession by the time their illnesses intervened decisively, which occurred in both cases at the age of 26. Hertervig lived on, being cared for in the community, as we might say today, albeit having had his civil status compromised on account of having been discharged from Gaustad as incurably insane. That community and family care was evidently reasonably successful for Hertervig because, so I understand again, we hear of little trouble, certainly little trouble that Hertervig himself may have caused, not that he was ever, I understand, himself violent, other than perhaps in some of his language. Hertervig, like Dad, continued to work, even if it was, again like Dad, for an extremely parochial audience. A last striking difference between the two is the quality of the materials in their post-illness years. While Dad was provided with the best quality materials with which to work, allowing him in technical terms to pick up and long continue where he left off before he became ill, after 1867, as we've just been hearing from Holger, Hertervig had to abandon oil on canvas and make do with whatever scraps of wrapping paper or wallpaper he could find. So here is a piece of paper that had been used to wrap tobacco, and from it, this scrap of paper, Hertervig makes this exquisite little work. A very different kind of exquisite work is this, also tiny, but on the slide blown up to enormous proportions, this little miniature watercolor by Dad, which is on a piece of really top quality paper, and indeed the technique that Dad continued to use, a kind of pointilliste, miniaturist, dotting, stippling technique, would not have been possible on any other than the finest art materials. So much for the crucial differences between Dad and Hertervig. So now, why bring them together at all? Well, Dad and Hertervig are members of a very restricted category. Academically trained 19th century fine artists whose professional careers and civil liberties were terminated by mental illness, but who continued for the rest of their lives to make art. The kind of artist who only began to make art after falling into illness, that type of patient who started to draw the attention of the medical professions from the 1860s, and who were much later labelled as makers of art brut or outsider art, are, as untrained creatives, outside of this category. We should indeed surely do better to look for fellow members of our category in less romantic places, perhaps forgotten provincial artists who began a career, had it undermined through illness, and yet painted on regardless, for no one in particular. However, at least one famous name does immediately suggest itself, and we've already heard about him today, the Swedish landscape painter Carl Friedrich Hill, who is happily going to be the subject of an exhibition alongside Hertervig here in this very museum early in 2025. The two artists, incidentally, Hill and Hertervig, have already previously, in 2005, been the joint subjects of an academic paper on the neuropsychiatry of visual creativity, which it is fair to say, without being overly critical of that paper, offers really questions and no answers. Nor am I here now going to, in the little time remaining to me, claim any measurable association between the art of Dad and Hertervig and their psychiatric conditions. Instead, what I think is more helpful is to look at the measurable reactions, criticisms, opinions of those around them, given their comparable circumstances. Now, regarding psychiatry's understanding of the illnesses of Hertervig and Dad during their lifetimes, let's start by saying that a roughly similar quantity of doctors' notes survives in each case. Now, that is to say that given the great disparity in the lengths of their hospitalization, Hertervig's case was in fact given relatively more medical attention than was Dad's. Dad, indeed, as a criminal lunatic in English law and under a legal order of permanent lifetime detention, was simply classed as insane, and that was that. He wasn't really a medical case, he was a criminal case. He was insane, put him away, end of. But Gaustad, the asylum outside Christiania, as I noted, had only just opened when Hertervig became a patient there in 1856. So when he arrived, Gaustad was still very much seeking to prove itself as a new kind of medical institution, and its clinical records were consequently thorough and precise. Hertervig was classed initially as a victim of melancholia, brought on perhaps by disappointment in love and or masturbation. We often laugh today at onanism being listed as a cause of insanity, but it was certainly taken seriously in Hertervig's case. The following year, the diagnosis was changed to dementia, a condition defined by Gaustad's director at this period as being, quote, characterized by fixed delusions, misrecognition of one's own personality, lack of coherence in thoughts and ideas, and consequent deranged actions, end of quote. Regarding Hertervig himself, the case notes describe him as having, quote, always been calm and quite orderly, and in some things, and on several occasions, has shown himself to be quite reasonable, but he is not able to hold a longer, orderly conversation. Then he immediately reveals his confusion by talking gibberish. Very similar things, in fact, were written about Richard Dad. Although he, Dad, had been subject to, prone to violent outbursts in his first years at Bethlehem, and in the early 1850s continued to be nothing less than disgusting, according to his case notes regarding his personal habits. Nevertheless, Richard Dad's case notes in the 1850s describe him as having been, quote, a very sensible and agreeable companion, and show in conversation a mind once well educated and thoroughly informed of all the particulars of his profession in which he still shines. But, continue the case notes for Dad in the 1850s, when he talks on any subject at all associated with the motives that influenced him to commit the crime for which he is confined here, he frequently becomes excited in his manner of speaking and soon rambles from the subject and becomes quite unintelligible, end of quote. Dad, nevertheless, evidently became, not long after, a better behaved patient, because in 1857, Dad was rewarded by being transferred out of the criminal wing of Bethlehem Hospital in London into better surroundings. From about this time, this wonderful photograph of Dad was taken, in which he is shown at work on another Shakespearean oil painting that had been commissioned from him by the superintendent of Bethlehem Hospital, Dr. Charles Hood, the author of the case notes from which I have just been quoting. Now, a few months just before Dad was upgraded in London, at Gaustad, Hertervig was effectively downgraded. In that period, 1857, Hertervig was, quote, transferred to Department B for the quiet sick, that is, the non-troublesome patients, of the less educated status. And in April 1858, he was discharged uncured. Now, I'm going to turn now to something that has actually already just been referenced by Holger. Dad's case notes make more of his profession as an artist than do Hertervig's, although the Gaustad notes for Hertervig do make reference to at least one uncomprehended effort on Hertervig's part to open up the subject of painting in an opaque manner. Hertervig himself apparently believed his problems to have been caused by his work as a painter, as we've heard. The case notes for Hertervig say, when asked if he knows any cause for his illness, he states that it is caused by staring at landscapes in the sunshine, during which, according to his explanation, the sun's rays have worked so strongly on his eyes that he has felt, and still feels, a dazing, shooting pain over the forehead. He names this as his only affliction, and this he believes to be caused by bleeding behind the frontal bone. End of quote. Equally, Richard Dad, when asked to account for himself to a doctor in France, where he had fled immediately after the murder of his father, the case notes in France say that Dad, quote, explained to us that he believed himself to be the son of the sun, le fils du soleil, at which he spent almost entire days staring without blinking and without any trouble caused to his vision other than a reddening in the appearance of objects. If we move on from this association of illness with staring into the light, to ask how these two artists' delusions related to their sense of themselves within their profession, then an intriguing, if not very flattering, result is returned. Both Dad and Hertervig seem to have become terrible snobs, feeling their status as artists raised them well above the level of ordinary men, let alone women. Alexander Hieland, in his astonishing account of meeting Hertervig in the early 1890s, concluded that, quote, but whoever paid attention to him, Hertervig, could well see that in the midst of the confusion of his mind he retained an unshakable consciousness of his own worth. He despised his surroundings and shunned them, and stood proud when he had to do with people whose lack of artistic understanding put them far below the level where he felt he truly belonged. End of quote. Really, exactly the same words might have been written accurately about Richard Dad. I have the sense, speaking as somebody not myself medically trained, that the social climbing element of the young artist's professional aspirations of their youth, unspoken or implicit at the time, showed itself glaringly once their illnesses removed certain inhibitions. Now, the final part of my paper, which is going to take 3 or 4 more minutes, is that okay? Is going to be about the posthumous reputation of the two artists and the problem to compare the parallel problems of what historians and critics were supposed to do with such extraordinary individuals when they come to try to place them within some kind of narrative or larger history of art. This idea, this idea of the two artists standing proudly aside from their contemporaries, working according to their own narratives, was continued by their champions after their deaths. The category of the art of the insane achieved the prestige it did from the late 19th century through the romantic idea of the untutored image maker offering a unique portal into the structures of the mind. But Dad and Hertervig were, of course, not untutored. To repeat a point already stressed, they had tried, each of them, very hard and had begun to succeed to become insiders, not outsiders. So where were Hertervig and Dad to be placed in the histories of art after their deaths if the outsider version of the art of the insane was not open to them? One answer was that a rediscovered eccentric might be awarded membership of an avant-garde movement avant le mot. And here I'm coming back to territory covered by Kilian in his paper, in which we think about what on earth you do with an artist once you have rediscovered them. You can't just slot them back into the gap that they left, as it were. Something more creative has to be done by historians. Thus, the great pioneer of Hertervig's rediscovery early in the 20th century, Hans Ødegaard, wrote that a new and strange view of heaven and earth and a solemn religious seriousness give these landscapes an inexplicable, captivating power, quote, as if Hertervig were a French symbolist, such as Gustave Moreau, for instance. Meanwhile, in the 1930s, Dad's hyper-conscious art was regularly compared to surrealism by the small number of aesthetes who knew it. So the rediscovered artist is reintroduced to the canon, courtesy of a current idiom of contemporary art, but out of sequence, aside, as it were, from linear chronology. This is a phenomenon we see among much earlier rediscovered artists. El Greco, for example, another honorary symbolist. There is, however, more to this process than simply flattering the past by the lights of the present. For at the end of the 19th and especially the start of the 20th century, the artistic avant-garde was often believed, indeed often believed itself, to have a special affinity with the fascinating creativity of the insane. The public perception of such a relationship reached an acutely intense phase just before the First World War, as art critics and psychiatrists debated whether asylum artists were more or less mad than the expressionist art by then being exhibited all over Europe. And again, we've heard a little bit about this in the context of Van Gogh. Around 1912, various group shows surveying the uncompromising spectrum of recent European avant-garde art shocked bourgeois audiences across Europe. Exasperated by the fashion for the emotionally extreme on show at Cologne in that year, 1912, the philosopher and psychiatrist Carl Jaspers felt that, quote, Van Gogh was the only unwilling madman among so many artists who wished to be insane, but were in fact all too healthy. So I'm talking about a rather vague, fashionable idea that mad expressionist modern art had some connection with art of the asylum, but that vague, woolly idea was now actually being fleshed out because it was increasingly possible to say and show what asylum art looked like, because it, in its turn, was starting to be written about and exhibited. In London, a comparable shock to sensibility was caused by this famous exhibition, Roger Fry's, to repeat again, a name we just heard from Holger. Roger Fry curated this exhibition in 1912 in London. Confusingly, he decided to call it post-impressionist, but by that term he wanted to lump together anything that was completely violently anti-academic in over the last 20 years or so. And its appearance, that 1912 exhibition, is generally reckoned as the watershed moment for visual modernism in Britain. But just as important for alternative histories of art was the huge exhibition of psychiatric patient art, really the defining exhibition of psychiatric patient art, which was shown as a kind of deliberate riposte to that exhibition in London, just down the road, at Bethlehem Hospital, where Dad had been a patient, in 1913, which had enormous press coverage. I'm showing you one bit of press coverage of that 1913 exhibition, in which the press critics deliberately tried to pick out from the asylum artists on show works which had superficial affinities with the isms doing the rounds at the time, cubism, fauvism, expressionism. The public eagerly bought into this idea that in some way they were looking at two sides of the same coin when they looked at official expressionism and when they looked at, so to speak, psychiatric expressionism. Dad, incidentally, is featured in this coverage. That's a work by Dad in the top middle row there, one of his Passions series. Although I have to say that actually at this point in the early 20th century, Hertervig's reputation overtakes that of Dad, because Dad had really fallen out of knowledge except for a very few sophisticated connoisseurs, and Dad's reputation was not to be fully revived among the general public for many years to come, not in fact until the heady days of the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1960s, with which we associate the great intellectual gurus such as Michel Foucault and R.D. Lang. Now, Hans Ødegaard brought Hertervig to notice by including him in the 1914 exhibition marking the centenary of the Norwegian Constitution. This interview with Ødegaard, forgive my pronunciation, in the Morgenbladet newspaper from April 1914 reproduces the tarn and the head of a fjord. Now, I suggest that Ødegaard's curatorial art historical endeavour to rehabilitate Hertervig took on a larger cultural impetus. It succeeded, in a word, at least in part, because of the timing, occurring as it did in the context I have outlined of the enthusiasm for linking the avant-garde with the art of the insane. I'm not trying to say that it turns out to have nothing to do with nation building and the enthusiasm for all things Norwegian of 1914. I am saying there is this extra strand of energy, intellectual energy, behind that rediscovery. The notion that Hertervig and Dad stand outside chronological narrative, in some way out of time, is still with us today as we seek to appreciate their work. An especially compelling account of Dad's fairy fella appeared in 1974 in a short, strange book by the Mexican writer Octavio Paz, El Monogrammático, the monkey grammarian. For Paz, the painting is an extremely concentrated meditation upon waiting. He says, the anticipation is eternal, it abolishes time. The anticipation is momentary, an awaiting of what is imminent. It speeds up time. End of quote. In the excellent catalogue accompanying the Visionary Romantics exhibition, Inga Gudmundsson, going to praise you again, Inga, I think you've already been praised once for this piece, writes very eloquently about time, in particular in relation to Hertervig's beautiful painting of his childhood home, about which Holger has just spoken, suggesting the melancholic viewer sets up temporal axes moving to and from the past, crossing at the point of the gaze. Are these poetic readings only made possible by a knowledge of the artist's extraordinary lives? Is the so-called art of the insane the last bastion of the romantic vision of the timeless work of art? I end by simply adding these questions to those you may wish to bear in mind as you walk around this lovely exhibition. Thank you very much.
There's a parallel to Hertervig, which was the idea of inviting you here to contextualize Hertervig's life situation, his biography, which you certainly did by making these parallels and how were psychiatric patients treated as artists, were they seen as artists, and this obviously vary. And I'd like to open with a question before we leave the room to the rest and to both of you. And because I think there is one question that is sort of hovering at the back of this, in addition to vision. There are so many narratives. I was also happy for you to point that out, Nick, because I don't think there is one exclusive narrative, one exclusive story. There are many ways we can look at these artists. But that is, of course, fighting not so much against the windmills as one did in Don Quixote. It's more like fighting against the canon, because the canon wants a big narrative and eats smaller artists, marginalized artists. And in Visionary Romantics, all the artists are well established in their own national art histories, but hardly known outside their own countries, apart from Balke but that's lately. And of course we hope to see a change in that, but I would also like to pose a question to you. How does an artist's situation, like for instance being diagnosed as mentally ill or mad, how does that affect that artist's status in his or her lifetime, but also in art history? So, who of you would like to start?
Well, I think, Nicholas, you explained that very well, actually. You know, that it depends on, you know, the general situation for how they look upon mental illnesses and the things going on in society. It's parallel. Many parallels here. I think it was extremely interesting, your parallel lives of these two artists. So hopefully we can talk more about that. I have a few questions, but you...
Yeah, but I perhaps need
to
reply to my last
Sure.
question.
Well, I think we heard it from Kilian earlier, which is this idea that you have to ask what's going on in the broader context. I mean, I'm fond of saying to students that, you know, people didn't talk much about mad artists in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries because those artists would have simply been unemployed. You know, you have like a mad artist in the same way that you'd have a mad accountant. Yeah, he or she wouldn't get much work, and the relationship would be over very quickly. And it's only really when the idea that madness might be some kind of opening up rather than closing down, and that's really comes at different points, but it comes acutely at the end of the 19th century, when people start to believe in these different layers of consciousness. Freud is just one version of that sense of layers of consciousness. The idea of the insane artist becomes an enormously attractive thing. And Van Gogh, although he needed to be rediscovered, let's be honest, he didn't have to wait long, did he? I mean, Van Gogh was sort of hovering briefly. He didn't have to wait as long as other artists did to be rediscovered around this time. I mean, so I think essentially I would say that yeah, being mad is very bad for your reputation until you get to the late 19th century, at which point you get to go to the front of the queue, and then again in the 1960s, when again there is this utopian idea in different countries that the age of psychiatry is over. Psychiatry was a scam. You know, it's a big conspiracy theory. It's society is at fault, or your mother's at fault. It's not you. And if you're doing weird stuff, then that probably makes you a rebel and a disruptor, as we would say now, not a sick person. And, you know, there are endless examples, aren't there, from the 60s, 1960s, of a kind of countercultural heroic figures. I mean, you just need to think about the cinema of that period in Britain, most famously, or in English-speaking film, A Clockwork Orange, you know, someone who would have been considered to be just very annoying, Alex in Kubrick's film of Anthony Burgess's novel, and probably today we would just think he's very annoying. But in the 60s and 70s, he was a sort of fascinating revolutionary figure.
Yeah. Could I just ask you one thing? I usually, when I talk about Hertervig, I reduce the problems with this madness, because it's kind of a strategy, I must admit. But I think it's has been important, you know, to let the other views on him come forth. That's why I've preferred that. But we don't know his mental situation. I mean, and there will be a lot of interest about this in the future, I think, you know, from psychiatrists and psychologists, etc., and even art historians. And I think it's important art historians are interested in this these themes, and they're not exclusively for the doctors, so to speak, because the doctors, they will just make people sick enough for them to be interested in them. So you have to watch out. So, but I would like to ask you, with Dad, which is an extremely interesting artist, is there a before and after in his art? It didn't look like that from your pictures, but what happens right around when this terrible murder accident was? Did he stop making paintings? Did it change it? He had a period like Hill, for instance. There's a very clear before and after, and in the psychotic stage, there is almost no activity. So that will be a very important exhibition to show the differences between them.
Perhaps Nick would like to answer that, and then I think even if Holger voluntarily takes over the moderator role, I think we will. I think we should ask also if the audience has any questions. But Nick, would you like to comment on that first?
Sure. Do I need that, or can I just speak?
Yes,
this?
you need that.
Okay. Yeah. So very, very, very quickly, because it's not satisfying for the audience to hear this without images to refer to. But essentially, after he became ill in 1842, something very interesting happens, which is that Dad starts to make very boring pictures. Something just goes out of them. They become flat. They're very kind of professional, but they're really boring for about a year or two. Then he goes into hospital, and there's a brief hiatus. And when he revives working, it's technically astounding. The technique has not gone. The technique is if not better than before, but there are all kinds of strange signs that he's no longer painting for an audience. And that's, I like you, I prefer, instead of saying he went mad, therefore he started painting funny pictures, I say, well, you know, if you're an artist and you were painting for the Royal Academy and then you're painting for no one, that's going to have an impact on your art. And I think it's the fact that he no longer had anyone to say, you can't do that. That doesn't make sense. So it remains a kind of question, a socially contextualized development.
Thank you. So a couple of questions from the room, and then we will have the other speakers up on the stage as well to have more of a general discussion. Yes, Kilian?
I have a question regarding what is really an illness in 19th century, because in Germany you have the idea that depression is absolutely important for being a good artist.
Yeah.
Because melancholia, it's you know that etching by Friedrich maybe is really a must to become a good artist. So in the Friedrich retrospective, he had this idea when he was a child. He was ice skiing with his brother, and his brother broke through the ice and drowned. And that is, for many, many interpretations of Friedrich, the idea thing that he had got a depression, and after that he became a genius artist. Yeah. And so we had the same with, not with an artist, with a philosopher. This is Friedrich Nietzsche. He was also a depression philosopher, so he was a good philosopher. But then he finally had this masturbation problem, and a lot of composers like Richard Wagner and his wife Cosima wrote on this masturbation problem of Friedrich Nietzsche, and that was the reason when it turned into illness. And then he became hospitalized, and then he was, of course, not anymore a good philosopher. So what is the borderline between illness and depression? I would like to know if you have any explanation of that. Would be interesting.
Dr. Tromans or Dr. Koefoed, who will start?
Both doctors, please.
Oh gosh, well, I'm an art historian, but I think what strikes me when I think about an answer to your question is, again, you've already in your talk provided an answer for it. It's which period are we talking about? The problem in Britain was that the art world, the world of painting, sculpture, printmaking, became so successfully professionalized from the end of the 18th century, and the state poured so much money into it, and it was so effective at creating institutions like the Royal Academy and various exhibiting societies and artists getting knighthoods, that it was the idea that mental illness was in any way beneficial was completely banished from the public sphere in Britain, specifically Britain. And the ideal of an artist was a healthy, clean young man brought up by a healthy, clean mother in a healthy, clean town, and who became a painter in the same way that he would have become an engineer or a doctor. And any suggestion that he had dirty personal habits or didn't like his mother would have been very embarrassing. You know, our great kind of heroes were Joshua Reynolds, John Everett Millais, men who you would trust with children, you know, and indeed who became famous painting children. That's not an accident. And it's only at the end of the 19th century, with the secession movement, when you start to get organizations of all kinds who start to wish to operate outside of the boundaries of the formal profession, that they start looking around anywhere for alternative hypotheses about what an artist or a composer might be. Well, actually, music is another whole subject that's going off the beaten track. But I think it takes even longer for mentally ill musicians to be acknowledged, because it's understood that to be a successful composer or musician, you can't lose touch with society. How do you get your pieces put on? So a composer like Ivor Gurney in Britain, who suffered severe schizophrenia after the First World War, he was completely forgotten until very recently, when people started to record and perform his music, because it was just considered that a mad musician was an impossibility, because a musician must always be embedded in a healthy society or set of friendships.
Concerning masturbation, I think the artist Lars Hertervig at the asylum, it's written that once he was observed masturbating by his guards. And I think this was after about more than a half year he'd been there. I think he found out that he saw that people who masturbated, they were sent home earlier than the others, because that changed their diagnosis. You see, from melancholy, which was something you could cure, and that way of thinking at that time. But if you...
That's exactly the point.
Yeah.
When it changes.
Yeah, exactly. So he was. So it was. I think it was. I mean, there was only this one incident, and I think he made a point of it being seen by the guard, and then very soon after he was sent home.
Good strategy, then, in a way. Good strategy, in a way. But you mentioned John Everett Millais. Didn't he run away with Ruskin's wife? I mean, so he wasn't that pure, was he? Well,
this is getting very sexy, this conversation.
yeah.
No, because this comes to Kilian's question. That John Everett, you know this story. You've probably seen the films. You've probably seen all the films. Millet saved the British cultural world by having sex with Effie Gray because Ruskin refused to or was incapable of, and Ruskin was mad.
That's slander.
That's how it was perceived. Even Queen Victoria eventually received Effie Gray and Millet at court, and it was Ruskin who was shown up to be mad because he wasn't a healthy, proper man. I mean, the British, despite locking up huge proportions of the population in the asylums, prided themselves on their liberty. Maybe things haven't changed very much, and so they spent a lot of time, the British, congratulating themselves that some of their cultural figures, Turner is the obvious one, were probably mad, but they, being British, did not lock them up, which was very good of them. So someone like Turner was considered to be like the borderline case. He was obviously melancholic, he was obviously weird, he was obviously incapable of having intimate relationships of a sexual or emotional or brotherly kind, and sometimes he did things which seemed completely mad. So Turner was the test case in later years. I mean, people often say that it's all about, oh, he used funny colours or he painted like a cook. But actually, I think a lot of that conversation around late Turner was, look, is this guy actually a lunatic or not?
When we started this project, our intention was really to take Hertervig a bit out of Stavanger, but also out of his biography, because he is so associated with his biography, this mad artist, outside artist, and rather see him as a painter. So I would rather suggest we start look at his works of Lucas, works of Balke, and you know, I still think even if Friedrich were not so visionary as we believe, the naturalist more, I think still other artists like Balke definitely was something of a visionary, even if they are based on nature. And I think, you know, we know from both Dahl and Friedrich, we usually see Dahl as the naturalist and Friedrich as the great visionary. But I mean, they did both. I mean, Dahl did mood landscapes, Friedrich observed nature, and the same goes for the others. So would anybody of the panel comment on that or on the last question? And that will be the final comment before we know. Any comment, or shall we say thank you?
Well, just the mention of Blake, and do we want to try and say a bit about what we feel the visionary is with landscape? Just to try and sum up what people feel that term means in regard to landscape. Is it just about, not just about, is it primarily about holding the landscape in the mind's eye and not based on anything observed? Or from the memory? Has anyone got any reflections on the visionary when it comes to landscape painting as an outcome of today and seeing the exhibition?
I think that is a question and an interesting one. Shall we leave on that unless, no? Herr Professor? No. No. I don't think we say thank you very much because it's 2:45 and we said it at 2.